I am Kiara, 28 years old, and my parents called me uneducated trash before kicking me out. "Get out, you loser," my dad screamed into the night. They had no idea I had just won an $80 million lottery jackpot. I left without saying a single word. 1 month later, their entire world fell apart. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in a wealthy neighborhood in Atlanta, Georgia, meant projecting a life of absolute privilege to outsiders. But inside our sprawling brick home, emotional coldness and conditional love permeated every single room. I was the family scapegoat, forever trapped in the shadow of their impossible expectations, constantly reminded of my supposed failures at every opportunity. My heavy canvas suitcase crashed onto the perfectly manicured front lawn. The zipper busted open upon impact, scattering my neatly folded catering aprons, shirts, and jeans across the damp evening grass. The loud thud echoed through our affluent subdivision, breaking the quiet of the night. Right behind the flying luggage came my father, Jerome. He was a 60-year-old regional director who cared far more about his pristine reputation at the local country club than his own flesh and blood. His face was contorted with a rage that I had become far too familiar with over the years. He pointed a shaking finger at me from the top of the porch steps. "Get out, you loser! You are uneducated trash!" His voice boomed loud enough for the neighbors across the street to hear, but he did not care about the public spectacle in that moment. He only cared about putting his youngest daughter in her place, establishing his dominance the way he always did. I stood there on the lawn, the cool night air biting at my cheeks, looking up at the man who was supposed to protect me. I did not cry. I had stopped crying over my father's cruel words a long time ago. The tears had dried up somewhere around my early 20s when I finally realized that nothing I did would ever be good enough to earn his respect. My mother, Brenda, stepped out onto the porch to stand right beside him. She had her arms crossed tightly over her chest, wearing her typical expression of deep, unwavering disappointment. At 58 years old, she was obsessed with status appearances and the opinions of her elite social circle. She did not look like a mother watching her youngest child being thrown out onto the street with nowhere to go. She looked like a landlord evicting a troublesome tenant who had missed rent. She adjusted her expensive cardigan and glared down at me while I bent to gather my scattered belongings from the dirt. "Nia and DeAndre need your room for their new crypto investment office." She snapped, her voice dripping with absolute disdain. "You are almost 30 years old, Kiara, baking cupcakes and serving food for pennies. It is pathetic and embarrassing. You need to stop dragging this family down." Her words were meant to cut me deeply, to remind me of my place at the very bottom of our family hierarchy. While I worked grueling hours as a freelance event caterer, trying to build an honest business with my own two hands, my parents viewed my passion as nothing more than a humiliating hobby. To them, manual labor and service industry work were beneath their social standing. They wanted corporate titles, boardrooms, and luxury vehicles they could brag about after Sunday service. My catering business, no matter how hard I worked, was just a persistent reminder of my failure to conform to their rigid materialistic expectations. The large mahogany front door swung open wider, and out stepped my older sister Nia, followed closely by her husband DeAndre. At 32, Nia was the undeniable golden child of the family. She was a real estate agent who spent more time curating her flawless life on social media than actually selling houses. Everything she did was celebrated. Every minor achievement was treated like a monumental victory by our parents. DeAndre, a 35-year-old who styled himself as a cryptocurrency investment genius, marched straight down the porch steps with a smug grin plastered across his face. Before I could react, he reached out and snatched the keys to my old Honda out of my hand. I stared at him in complete shock as he dangled my only means of transportation in front of my face like a toy. "This car is in Jerome's name," DeAndre said smoothly, his tone dripping with unearned arrogance. "I need it for my new office assistants to run errands. You can walk from here, little sister. walk. In the middle of the night, in a sprawling suburban neighborhood located miles away from the nearest bus stop or train station. They were literally stripping me of everything I had. My home, my dignity, and my transportation, all to clear the way for DeAndre's latest questionable business scheme. The utter lack of empathy from my own flesh and blood was staggering, yet entirely predictable given our long history of toxic dynamics. Nia crossed her arms, standing safely behind her husband, mimicking our mother's posture of judgment. "You should have thought about this before you decided to be a college dropout." Nia sneered. "If you had just finished your degree like a normal person, you would not be begging to stay in your childhood bedroom while real adults are trying to run a business." Her condescending words ignited a massive spark of anger that I could no longer suppress. I dropped the shirts I was holding and stood up straight, meeting my sister's arrogant gaze. "I only dropped out of college because Mom stole my social security number." I yelled back, my voice echoing across the darkened street. The shock on Nia's face was instantaneous, but my mother physically flinched, her eyes darting away in guilt. "You needed an extravagant wedding that Dad could not afford." I continued, the ugly truth finally pouring out after years of toxic silence. "So Mom secretly opened 5 different credit cards in my name, maxed them all out to pay for your designer dress and your fancy ice sculptures, and completely ruined my credit score. I lost my student loans because of that massive fraud. I was forced to drop out because I could not pay the tuition, not because I was stupid or lazy. You are standing there calling me uneducated trash when you literally built your perfect wedding on top of my stolen future." The heavy silence that followed my outburst was suffocating. My father glared at my mother clearly, unaware of the full extent of her financial crimes, but he quickly masked his surprise with blind anger directed back at me. "How dare you speak to your mother that way?" he bellowed, stepping forward as if to physically intimidate me. "You have always been a liar and a manipulator. Get off my property right now before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing." I looked at the 4 of them standing together on the porch, a united front of toxicity, greed, and deception. They expected me to break down. They wanted me to fall to my knees on the wet grass, beg for their forgiveness, and plead for a place to safely sleep for the night. They thrived on my desperation and my tears. But I did not cry. I did not scream anymore. Instead, I shoved my right hand deep into the pocket of my catering jacket. My fingers wrapped tightly around a small, crisp piece of paper. It was a Georgia Mega Millions lottery ticket. I had checked the numbers on my phone just 2 hours before this explosive confrontation. I was the sole jackpot winner. I was holding $80 million in my pocket. The sheer magnitude of that secret wrapped around me like an impenetrable shield, making their cruel insults and petty thefts sound like distant, meaningless static. Their attempts to destroy my life were entirely irrelevant now. A cold, steady smile spread across my face, completely unsettling my family. "Keep the car," I said, my voice dangerously calm and utterly devoid of emotion. "I do not need anything from this house ever again." I picked up my broken suitcase, turned my back on the people who had abused me my entire life, and walked away into the dark night. Exactly 1 month later, I was sitting in my newly purchased $5 million penthouse overlooking the Atlanta skyline, when my phone suddenly rang. It was Brenda calling from her personal cell phone. I answered only to hear her crying hysterically. "Kiara, please pick up the phone right now. DeAndre is in terrible, inescapable trouble with his investors, and we are about to lose the family house forever." I stared at the glowing screen of my new phone, watching my mother's frantic text messages and voicemails roll in one after another. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. Her voice crackled through the speaker, breathless and desperate, begging me to answer because DeAndre was in terrible trouble and the bank was threatening to take the house. I simply pressed delete, permanently erasing her panic from my life, and tossed the phone onto the imported white leather sofa of my penthouse. Over the past 4 weeks, I had executed a financial masterclass in total, impenetrable secrecy. The very morning after I walked off my parents' lawn with nothing but the clothes on my back, I marched straight into the offices of the most ruthless, high-powered corporate law firm in downtown Atlanta. I handed them my winning ticket and instructed them to set up an ironclad blind trust. We officially named it Peach State Wealth Management. Through this impenetrable legal fortress, my true identity as the sole winner of the $80 million Mega Millions jackpot was completely shielded from the public and, far more importantly, from my toxic family. But I did not stop at simply hiding my newly acquired wealth. I carefully and deliberately weaponized it. I knew my father Jerome had been desperately leveraging every single asset he owned to keep up his ridiculous appearances at the church and to blindly fund DeAndre's non-existent cryptocurrency empire. My elite team of lawyers easily discovered that my parents were drowning in secondary mortgages and predatory high-interest loans. Using a newly formed untraceable shell company operating under the Peach State umbrella, I bought the primary debt on my childhood home directly from their struggling overextended bank. The transaction was swift, highly clinical, and completely legal. Jerome and Brenda had absolutely no idea that the faceless corporate entity, now holding the deed to their pristine beloved status symbol mansion, was actually the very same daughter they had violently thrown out onto the street just 30 short days prior. I was no longer their scapegoat. I was their sole creditor. If they missed a single payment by even 1 hour, I held the absolute power to evict them with the simple stroke of a pen. To celebrate the finalizing of the mortgage acquisition and my newfound power, my wealth manager, a remarkably sharp and sophisticated man named Marcus, invited me out for a celebratory dinner. We chose Le Petit Chateau, an obscenely expensive and highly exclusive French restaurant located right in the heart of Buckhead. It was the exact kind of establishment where reservations took months to secure the valet's only parked luxury imports, and the menus deliberately did not list any prices. I arrived wearing a custom-tailored emerald green silk dress that cost significantly more than I used to make in 6 grueling months of catering events. A delicate, breathtaking diamond tennis necklace rested perfectly against my collarbone. When the highly attentive maitre d' greeted us, he immediately escorted Marcus and me to the premier VIP booth, a secluded velvet-lined alcove elevated slightly above the main dining floor. I ordered a bottle of rare vintage champagne, feeling a profound, untouchable sense of peace wash over me as I surveyed the elegant, softly lit room. But the universe always has a wicked, unpredictable sense of humor. Halfway through tasting our imported caviar appetizers, my gaze drifted across the dining room and landed on a painfully familiar group of people. Sitting at a cramped, poorly positioned table right near the noisy kitchen swinging doors were Jerome, Brenda, Nia, and DeAndre. The stark, undeniable contrast between my current luxurious reality and their clear, desperate situation was staggering. My father was sweating visibly through the collar of his suit, leaning intensely across the table, with a forced, highly unnatural smile plastered on his face. DeAndre was frantically shuffling through a thick stack of disorganized, colorful financial portfolios, talking rapidly with his hands in a desperate attempt to look competent. Sitting directly across from them, looking profoundly bored, was Marcus Pierce Sr., one of Atlanta's most notorious and ruthless venture capitalists. It was immediately obvious to anyone paying attention exactly what was happening. DeAndre's fraudulent crypto business was rapidly collapsing, and my family was shamelessly begging this billionaire for a massive financial lifeline to save themselves from total ruin. Brenda sat rigidly in her uncomfortable wooden chair, clutching her fake designer handbag against her chest like a life preserver, trying desperately to project the image of a wealthy, successful, unbothered matriarch. I watched with quiet amusement as the venture capitalist blatantly checked his heavy gold luxury watch, clearly unimpressed and exhausted by DeAndre's frantic, empty sales pitch. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my crisp champagne, thoroughly enjoying the delicious irony of the moment. I had absolutely zero intention of interacting with them. They were simply providing a live, pathetic theater performance for my evening entertainment. But then Nia turned her head sharply to signal a passing waiter for more water. Her eyes swept across the elevated VIP section and locked directly onto mine. I saw the physical shock violently ripple through her entire body. She blinked rapidly, her jaw physically dropping open as she took in my flawless emerald silk dress, the heavy diamonds sparkling brightly at my throat, and the commanding presence of my high-powered wealth manager sitting respectfully across from me. For a fleeting moment, she looked like she had just seen a ghost. Then the shock rapidly melted into a fierce, uncontrollable, and ugly jealousy. Without any warning or explanation to her table, Nia abruptly shoved her chair back completely, ignoring her husband's desperate ongoing presentation to the billionaire. She marched aggressively across the dining room floor, her cheap heels clicking loudly and obnoxiously against the polished hardwood. She arrogantly bypassed the velvet rope separating the VIP section from the common dining area and stormed right up to the edge of my table. Her face was fiercely contorted with the exact same ugly, dismissive rage our father had proudly displayed on the front lawn a month prior. "Whose stolen credit card did you use to eat here, you pathetic lowlife?" Naya hissed, her voice vibrating with pure venom, yet kept just low enough to avoid drawing the restaurant security immediately. "Are you waitressing out back and decided to play dress-up with a wealthy customer's coat? You are going to get arrested. Get out of here right now before you embarrass Dad in front of Mr. Pierce." Marcus. My wealth manager slowly set down his silver fork and looked up at Nia with a mixture of profound confusion and intense, unfiltered distaste. He opened his mouth to call for the restaurant manager to have her forcibly removed, but I raised a single manicured finger, silencing him instantly. I leaned back against the plush, comfortable velvet seat completely and utterly unbothered by her aggressive, pathetic posturing. I did not flinch away. I did not look down. I simply stared directly into her eyes, letting the heavy silence stretch out until her false, arrogant bravado began to visibly crack and splinter. Her eyes darted obsessively to my diamond necklace, the raw, painful envy burning brightly and pathetically in her pupils. "You always were so incredibly loud whenever you were terrified, Nia," I said, my voice remarkably smooth, steady, and commanding. "You should really lower your voice and walk away before your husband's potential investor realizes his entire business pitch is nothing but a pathetic, hollow scam." At the direct mention of the wealthy investor, Nia's face flushed a deep, ugly, and angry red. She slammed her hand down violently on the edge of our table, aggressively rattling the crystal champagne flutes. "You shut your mouth right now." She spat, her eyes widening with rage. "DeAndre is pitching a multi-million-dollar corporate expansion. You know absolutely nothing about high-level business, you uneducated catering trash." The growing commotion had finally inevitably drawn the attention of their table across the room. Jerome turned around in his chair, his eyes widening in absolute horror as he finally spotted me sitting in the VIP section. DeAndre stopped talking mid-sentence, his confident salesman facade instantly and completely crumbling into genuine panic. The venture capitalist, Mr. Pierce, frowned deeply at the rude interruption and turned his chair around to face the source of the distracting noise. He looked at my sister, then looked at me, and finally looked directly at my wealth manager, whom he clearly and immediately recognized from the elite Atlanta financial circuit. I picked up my pristine white linen napkin, delicately dabbed the corners of my mouth, and stood up slowly and gracefully from the booth. I smoothed the front of my expensive silk dress, ignoring my sister entirely, and locked my eyes directly with the billionaire investor sitting 15 feet away. "If I were you, Mr. Pierce, I would not invest a single dime in that man's failing company," I declared, my voice carrying clearly and confidently across the suddenly quiet dining room. DeAndre's main crypto wallet was completely liquidated exactly 3 weeks ago due to massive margin calls, and his current hidden liabilities far exceed $2 million. The entire restaurant seemed to gasp in absolute stunned unison. The investor's face immediately dropped into a hard mask of pure, unadulterated fury. DeAndre turned absolutely pale-looking, as though the solid floor had just vanished entirely beneath his feet. The heavy silence that followed was completely deafening. How could the uneducated catering trash possibly know the exact highly classified details of his hidden financial ruin? Mr. Pierce's sharp, calculating eyes shifted rapidly from my steady gaze to the terrified, glistening face of my brother-in-law. The billionaire venture capitalist did not become one of the wealthiest men in Atlanta by ignoring massive, glaring red flags. He paused, his sharp gaze moving from DeAndre to Marcus, my wealth manager sitting calmly across from me. A silent, instantaneous mutual understanding passed between the two financial titans. Mr. Pierce recognized Marcus immediately. He knew that a senior partner at Peach State Wealth Management would never associate with a low-level scammer, nor would he allow his high-net-worth client to make baseless accusations in a public setting. Mr. Pierce stood up from the cramped table calmly and deliberately buttoning his bespoke suit jacket. He did not yell or cause a scene. He simply looked down at DeAndre with utter, unfiltered disgust. "I do not do business with liars," Mr. Pierce said, his voice carrying the lethal, icy weight of a judge passing a final sentence. "And I certainly do not do business with insolvent frauds." DeAndre scrambled out of his wooden chair, his knee violently knocking against the table leg and nearly tipping over a silver ice bucket. "Mr. Pierce, wait. It is a massive misunderstanding." DeAndre pleated, his hands reaching out in a pathetic grasping motion, but stopping just short of actually touching the billionaire. "She is just a bitter, estranged sister making up lies because she is jealous of our success." Mr. Pierce did not even dignify the pathetic display with a response. He signaled his private security detail with a sharp, dismissive nod and walked out of the restaurant without a single backward glance, completely vaporizing DeAndre's very last chance at a financial bailout. Across the room, my father watched his golden ticket evaporate into the humid Atlanta night. The thick vein in Jerome's forehead throbbed visibly, a clear indicator of his rapidly escalating blood pressure. He slammed his heavy fist onto his table, causing the silverware to jump and clatter loudly. He completely abandoned Brenda, who was frantically using her menu to hide her face from the staring, whispering patrons at the adjacent tables. Jerome stormed across the dining room, his heavy footsteps thudding aggressively against the imported rugs. He bypassed the velvet rope separating the VIP section from the main floor, just as Nia had done moments before, his face a terrifying, rigid mask of unchecked aggression. He shoved his way right up to my table, his chest heaving with exertion and pure malice. "You vindictive, jealous little brat!" Jerome snarled, his voice rising in volume, completely disregarding the hushed, elegant atmosphere of Le Petit Chateau. "You just cost this family millions of dollars. You have always ruined everything for your sister, just like you ruined her Sweet 16. The direct mention of Nia's Sweet 16 party ignited a massive, long-dormant fire deep within my chest. It was the ultimate heavily fabricated weapon they always used against me, to paint me as the unstable, attention-seeking younger sibling. But the actual truth was a heavy, suffocating burden I had carried in absolute silence for over a decade. I did not shrink back into my plush velvet seat. I stood up tall, my emerald silk dress catching the ambient light, and stepped directly into my father's personal space. I did not ruin it. I fired back, my voice ringing out clear, sharp, and loud enough for the neighboring VIP tables to hear every single word of his exposed hypocrisy. I collapsed from sheer physical exhaustion. I collapsed because I was working double shifts at a greasy diner off the highway to pay for the luxury DJ you promised her but could not actually afford. Jerome's face went completely pale, the angry red flush draining away in a matter of seconds. I pressed on, finally tearing down the pristine facade he had spent years hiding behind his fake country club smile. "You lied to all your friends at the church. You told everyone you rented the grand ballroom and hired the premium entertainment outright. But the reality was that your credit cards were declined. You begged me, your 16-year-old daughter, to empty my saved-up tutoring money to bail you out of your own financial incompetence. I worked 36 hours straight, washing filthy dishes and scrubbing floors just so Nia could have her perfect unearned spotlight. And when my severely dehydrated body finally gave out and I fainted right in the middle of the dance floor, you did not call an ambulance. You dragged me into the coat room and told everyone I fainted on purpose to steal her attention. You let me wake up alone on a pile of jackets while you toasted to your own manufactured success. Nia gasped loudly, taking a physical step backward, as the ugly truth echoed around the suddenly quieted restaurant. Diners were openly staring now, their forks suspended in midair, thoroughly captivated by the collapse of Jerome's carefully curated upper-class image. The massive public spectacle had finally drawn the immediate attention of the restaurant's general manager. Monsieur Laurent, a distinguished man with silver hair and an impeccably tailored suit, approached our table flanked by two large, broad-shouldered security guards. Jerome saw them coming and immediately puffed out his chest, a triumphant, nasty sneer replacing his momentary shock. He firmly believed that the natural order of the universe was about to restore itself, that the wealthy establishment would side with the older, imposing man in a suit over the daughter he had deemed worthless. "It is about time you got here," Jerome barked at the general manager, pointing a rigid, accusatory finger directly at my face. "Get this trash out of here immediately. She is harassing my family and causing a severe disturbance. She does not even belong in a high-class place like this. Throw her out on the street where she belongs." Monsieur Laurent did not even blink at my father's aggressive command. He completely ignored Jerome's pointing finger and turned his attention entirely to me. He bowed his head in a deep, highly respectful gesture of absolute deference. "Miss Chiara," Monsieur Laurent said, his tone incredibly warm, soothing, and deeply apologetic. "I am so terribly sorry for this unacceptable intrusion on your evening. Are these individuals bothering you and Mr. Marcus?" Jerome's jaw literally dropped open. The triumphant sneer slid right off his face, instantly replaced by utter, incomprehensible shock. He looked frantically between the elegant manager, my highly amused wealth manager, and me, his brain completely failing to process the reality of the shifting power dynamic. "What are you doing?" Jerome stammered, his voice losing all of its previous booming authority. "I told you to throw her out. She is a caterer. She cannot even afford a glass of water in this place." Monsieur Laurent finally turned to look at my father, and the warmth in his eyes was instantly extinguished, replaced by a glacial, professional disdain reserved only for the most unruly of guests. "Sir, Miss Chiara is one of our most valued premium VIP patrons. You and your party, however, are severely violating our strict conduct policy and causing a massive disturbance to our esteemed guests. I must ask you to leave my establishment immediately." "You cannot do this," Nia shrieked from behind my father, her face burning with profound, inescapable public humiliation. "We are important people. We are trying to conduct business." The two massive security guards stepped forward simultaneously, their imposing presence leaving absolutely no room for debate, negotiation, or further outbursts. Brenda had finally scurried over from their abandoned table near the kitchen, grabbing Jerome's arm tightly in a desperate, frantic attempt to drag him away before someone recorded the humiliating scene on their smartphone. My family was being publicly, unceremoniously thrown out of the very restaurant they had tried to use to cement their fake elite status. The reversal of fortune was absolute. As the security guards began to physically herd the four of them toward the main exit, Jerome resisted for one final bitter second. He planted his feet and leaned in incredibly close to me, his eyes burning with a toxic, desperate hatred. The sheer humiliation of being exposed as a fraud and evicted from a luxury restaurant had pushed him entirely over the edge of reason. He could not accept defeat, so he reached for the only weapon he thought he still possessed: his influence over my livelihood. "You think you are so incredibly smart?" Jerome hissed, his voice trembling with venomous rage and wounded pride. "You think putting on a fancy dress and tricking some manager makes you powerful? You are nothing. You will never work a single catering gig in Atlanta again. I will make sure of it. I will ruin your name with every event planner in this city." He did exactly that. By 8 o'clock the following morning, my phone was practically vibrating off the marble kitchen island of my penthouse. Jerome was a man who wielded his connections at our mega church and the local Atlanta business networks like a blunt, heavy weapon. He had spent the entire night making phone calls, spinning a vicious, highly calculated narrative. The emails from frantic brides, corporate event coordinators, and church social committees all echoed the exact same fabricated lies. He told them I stole from client petty cash. He told them I cut corners by serving expired ingredients to maximize my own profits. He even went so far as to tell a prominent wedding planner that I had a severe substance abuse problem and was highly unreliable. One email from a senior deaconess explicitly stated she could not support a young woman who was so deeply disrespectful to her elders and engaged in criminal behavior. The sheer speed and ruthlessness of his smear campaign were breathtaking. He was deliberately trying to destroy my name, my reputation, and my livelihood. He wanted to starve me out, cutting off my meager income, to force me back onto his doorstep on my hands and knees, begging for forgiveness and a place to sleep. But he was incredibly foolish. He was attacking a ghost. I stood in my kitchen sipping a freshly brewed espresso and laughed out loud. The sound echoed through the massive empty space of my luxury high-rise. They were canceling gigs on a decoy website. I had kept the old booking page active precisely because I knew my father would eventually try to attack the only thing he thought I valued. He thought my entire existence depended on those catering gigs. He had absolutely no idea that I was sitting on $80 million in untouchable capital. His vicious attacks were bouncing off an armored tank. I set my coffee cup down and called my commercial real estate broker, David. We met an hour later in the private glass-walled conference room of Peach State Wealth Management. I slid a sleek black folder across the polished table. Inside were the complete property records for the Oak Ridge Commercial Park. It was a sprawling 30-acre industrial complex on the edge of the city, and it housed the absolute crown jewel of my father's massive ego. Jerome's logistics company operated out of the largest, most prominent warehouse in that exact park. It was the physical proof of his supposed success, the place where he hosted networking events, paraded his expensive leased vehicles, and pretended to be a titan of industry. "I want to buy it," I told David, flatly tapping the folder. "The entire park." David reviewed the documents and raised a skeptical eyebrow. "The current owners are an old family trust, Kiara. They are not actively looking to sell. It will take a massive premium to get them to part with a property generating this much steady, passive revenue. Offer them 40% over current market value in pure cash." I instructed, my voice entirely devoid of hesitation or emotion. "Tell them the offer expires in exactly 48 hours and the transaction must be executed immediately through my anonymous shell company. I want absolute discretion." David nodded, recognizing the lethal resolve in my tone. Within 2 days, the massive wire transfers cleared. I was now the sole owner of the Oak Ridge Commercial Park. I owned the pavement my father drove his luxury cars on. I owned the structural roof over his precious logistics empire. And most importantly, I now owned his commercial lease. Later that exact same week, Jerome was hosting the monthly meeting of his church deacon board right inside his massive corner office. I knew his schedule perfectly because my mother used to brag about these specific meetings endlessly to her social circle. Jerome loved hosting the esteemed deacons at his warehouse because it allowed him to physically showcase his wealth, his authority, and his status as a provider. He sat behind his massive, custom-built oak desk, wearing a sharply tailored suit, surrounded by older men who looked up to him as a pillar of the community. He leaned back in his expensive leather executive chair, holding a cup of premium coffee, holding court like a king. "We have to stand incredibly firm in our righteous values, gentlemen." Jerome projected, his voice dripping with false piety and manufactured sorrow. "In business, and especially in our homes, when the younger generation loses their way, when they turn to theft, disrespect, and rebellion, we must show them tough love. We must cut off the dead branches so the rest of the family tree can truly thrive." He was, of course, talking about me. He was actively painting himself as the tragic, loving, and long-suffering father who was forcibly required to cut off a criminal daughter for the greater good of his family. He was completely convinced that his ruthless smear campaign had already driven me out of the city in disgrace. He thought he had successfully neutralized the threat I posed at the French restaurant by destroying my catering reputation. The deacons nodded in solemn, naive agreement, praising his wisdom, his strong leadership, and his unwavering moral compass. Right in the middle of his boastful, hypocritical sermon, a sharp, loud knock interrupted the meeting. A private legal courier stepped directly into the office holding a thick, rigid manila envelope. Jerome frowned heavily at the unwanted interruption but quickly adjusted his facial expression. He decided to use the moment to show off to the deacons just how crucial and busy his corporate operations were. "Just urgent business matters, gentlemen," Jerome chuckled arrogantly, waving the courier forward with a flick of his wrist. Being the boss means the heavy work never stops. The wheels of industry keep turning. He signed the electronic delivery pad with a large, dramatic flourish and tore open the envelope right in front of his captive, admiring audience. He pulled out the crisp, heavy legal documents, expecting a new shipping contract or a vendor agreement. I had specifically instructed my elite legal team to draft the notice with zero pleasantries and maximum aggression. As Jerome read the first paragraph, his arrogant, self-satisfied smile froze instantly. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin an ashen, sickly gray. His hands began to tremble so violently that the expensive paper rattled audibly in the quiet room. The document was a formal, legally binding notification of new ownership from a corporate entity named Peach State Wealth Management. But the second page contained the real, inescapable devastation. Because Jerome had been struggling financially for years, he had never secured a long-term commercial lease, opting instead for a risky month-to-month agreement to avoid long-term liability. It was a fatal business error. The notice clearly outlined a mandatory 300% rent increase, effective immediately at the start of the next billing cycle. If he failed to agree to the new astronomical terms, it served as a formal, non-negotiable 14-day notice of absolute eviction. The financial demand was mathematically impossible for him to meet. It was designed specifically to bankrupt his already struggling, highly leveraged logistics company within a single month. Jerome looked up from the paper, his breathing shallow, rapid, and panicked. The flawless facade of the wealthy, untouchable community leader completely shattered right in front of his most esteemed peers. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some kind of excuse, but no words came out, only a choked, breathless gasp, as he realized the invisible crushing walls were rapidly closing in. Mr. Pierce did not become a billionaire venture capitalist by ignoring glaring, catastrophic red flags. His sharp, calculating eyes darted from DeAndre's pale, excessively sweating face to the calm, composed posture of my wealth manager sitting directly across from me. The silent, instantaneous recognition between the two financial titans was absolute and undeniable. Mr. Pierce knew exactly who Marcus was. He knew that a senior managing partner at the highly exclusive Peach State Wealth Management would never sit in a premier VIP booth with a liar, nor would he ever allow his high-net-worth client to make baseless, slanderous accusations in a public setting. The complex financial math instantly clicked together in the veteran investor's mind. The colorful, meticulously bound, yet entirely disorganized portfolios DeAndre had been frantically shuffling were nothing but a desperate, hollow illusion designed to steal his capital. Mr. Pierce stood up from the cramped, poorly positioned wooden chair calmly and deliberately, buttoning the front of his bespoke charcoal suit jacket. He did not yell. He did not cause a scene. He simply looked down at my brother-in-law, with a gaze so cold and piercing it could have frozen water. "I do not do business with insolvent frauds," Mr. Pierce declared, his voice carrying the lethal heavy weight of a judge passing a final, irrevocable sentence. DeAndre scrambled out of his chair so fast his knee violently struck the table leg, sending a crystal water glass shattering onto the polished hardwood floor. The sharp sound of breaking glass echoed through the dining room. "Mr. Pierce, please wait. It is a massive misunderstanding." DeAndre pleaded, his hands reaching out in a pathetic grasping motion, but stopping just short of actually touching the billionaire's sleeve. "She is just a bitter, estranged sister making up vicious lies because she is incredibly jealous of our corporate success. You have to look at the expansion projections. We are on the verge of a massive breakthrough." Mr. Pierce did not even dignify the pathetic, groveling display with a verbal response. He signaled his private security detail with a sharp, dismissive nod and walked out of the elegant French restaurant without a single backward glance. He completely vaporized DeAndre's very last chance at a financial bailout. The heavy brass-handled glass doors swung shut behind the investor, effectively sealing my family's total financial ruin. Across the softly lit dining room, my father watched his golden ticket evaporate into the humid Atlanta night. The thick, prominent vein in Jerome's forehead throbbed visibly, a clear, undeniable indicator of his rapidly escalating blood pressure. He slammed his heavy fist onto his table, causing the expensive silverware to jump and clatter loudly against the fine porcelain plates. He completely abandoned my mother Brenda, who was frantically using her oversized leather-bound menu to hide her face from the staring, whispering patrons at the adjacent tables. Jerome stormed across the dining room floor, his heavy footsteps thudding aggressively against the imported Persian rugs. He violently shoved his way past the thick velvet rope separating the elevated VIP section from the main floor, his face a terrifying, rigid mask of unchecked aggression. He marched right up to the edge of my table, his chest heaving with physical exertion and pure, unadulterated malice. He completely ignored Marcus, focusing all of his toxic rage entirely on me. "You vindictive, jealous little brat!" Jerome snarled, his voice rising in volume, completely disregarding the hushed, elegant atmosphere of Le Petit Chateau. "You just cost this family millions of dollars in secured investments. You have always ruined everything for your sister, just like you ruined her Sweet 16. The direct weaponized mention of Nia's Sweet 16 party ignited a massive, long-dormant fire deep within my chest. It was the ultimate heavily fabricated weapon they always used against me at every single family gathering, to paint me as the unstable, attention-seeking younger sibling who constantly needed to sabotage her older sister's happiness. But the actual unvarnished truth was a heavy, suffocating burden I had carried in absolute silence for over a decade, simply to protect his fragile manufactured ego. I did not shrink back into my plush velvet seat. I did not avert my eyes. I stood up tall, my emerald silk dress catching the ambient light, and stepped directly into my father's personal space. "I didn't ruin it." I fired back, my voice ringing out clear, sharp, and loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear every single word of his exposed hypocrisy. I collapsed from exhaustion because I was working double shifts at a diner to pay for the DJ you promised her but couldn't afford. Jerome's face went completely pale, the angry red flush draining away in a matter of seconds. The entire dining room went dead silent, every single wealthy patron hanging on my every word. I pressed on, finally tearing down the pristine, flawless facade he had spent years hiding behind his fake country club smile. "You lied to all your wealthy friends at the church. You told everyone you rented the grand ballroom and hired the premium entertainment outright with your own massive success. But the harsh reality was that your credit cards were completely maxed out and declined. You begged me, your 16-year-old daughter, to empty my saved-up tutoring money to bail you out of your own financial incompetence. I worked 36 hours straight washing filthy dishes and scrubbing greasy floors until my hands bled just so Nia could have her perfect unearned spotlight. And when my severely dehydrated, overworked body finally gave out and I fainted right in the middle of the dance floor, you did not call an ambulance. You dragged me into the dark coat room and told everyone I fainted on purpose to steal her attention. You let me wake up alone on a pile of heavy winter jackets while you stood out in the ballroom and toasted to your own manufactured success as a provider." Nia gasped loudly from across the room, taking a physical step backward as the ugly, undeniable truth echoed around the restaurant. Diners were openly staring now, their silver forks suspended in midair, thoroughly captivated by the total public collapse of Jerome's carefully curated upper-class image. The massive public spectacle had finally drawn the immediate, urgent attention of the restaurant's general manager. Monsieur Laurent, a distinguished man with perfectly groomed silver hair and an impeccably tailored designer suit, approached our table, flanked rapidly by two large, broad-shouldered security guards. Jerome saw them coming and immediately puffed out his chest, a triumphant, nasty sneer, replacing his momentary shock and embarrassment. He firmly believed that the natural order of the universe was about to quickly restore itself. He was absolutely certain that the wealthy high-end establishment would immediately side with the older, imposing man in a business suit over the estranged daughter he had deemed utterly worthless. "It is about time you got here," Jerome barked aggressively at the general manager, pointing a rigid accusatory finger directly at my face. "Get this trash out of here immediately. She is harassing my family and causing a severe disturbance to your patrons. She does not even belong in a high-class place like this. She is a low-level caterer. Throw her out on the street where she belongs before I call the police myself." Monsieur Laurent did not even blink at my father's aggressive command. He completely ignored Jerome's pointing finger and turned his attention entirely to me. He bowed his head in a deep, highly respectful gesture of absolute deference. "Miss Chiara, Monsieur Laurent," said his tone incredibly warm, soothing, and deeply apologetic. "I am so terribly sorry for this unacceptable intrusion on your lovely evening. Are these individuals bothering you and Mr. Marcus?" Jerome's jaw literally dropped open. The triumphant sneer slid right off his face, instantly replaced by utter, incomprehensible shock. He looked frantically between the elegant manager, my highly amused wealth manager, and me, his brain completely failing to process the reality of the shifting, undeniable power dynamic. "What are you doing?" Jerome stammered, his voice losing all of its previous booming authority. "I told you to throw her out. She cannot even afford a glass of tap water in this place." Monsieur Laurent finally turned to look at my father, and the warmth in his eyes was instantly extinguished, replaced by a glacial professional disdain reserved only for the most unruly and disrespectful of guests. "Sir, Miss Chiara is one of our most valued premium VIP regular guests. You and your party, however, are severely violating our strict conduct policy and causing a massive, unacceptable disturbance. I must ask you to leave my establishment immediately." "You cannot do this!" Nia shrieked, rushing over to join her father, her face burning with profound, inescapable public humiliation. "We are important people. We are trying to conduct high-level business." The two massive security guards stepped forward simultaneously, their imposing presence leaving absolutely no room for debate, negotiation, or further outbursts. Brenda had finally scurried over from their abandoned table near the swinging kitchen doors, grabbing Jerome's arm tightly in a desperate, frantic attempt to drag him away before someone recorded the humiliating scene on their smartphone. My family was being publicly, unceremoniously thrown out of the very restaurant they had tried to use to cement their fake elite status. The reversal of fortune was absolute and devastating. As the security guards began to physically herd the four of them toward the main exit, Jerome resisted for one final bitter second. He planted his feet and leaned in incredibly close to me, his eyes burning with a toxic, desperate hatred. The sheer humiliation of being exposed as a fraud and evicted from a luxury restaurant had pushed him entirely over the edge of reason. He could not accept defeat, so he reached for the only weapon he thought he still possessed. Humiliated Jerome glares at Chiara. "You think you're smart? You'll never work a single catering gig in Atlanta again. I'll make sure of it." True to his malicious word, my father did not waste a single second executing his promised vengeance. By 8 o'clock the very next morning, my phone was practically vibrating off the marble kitchen island of my penthouse. Jerome was a man who wielded his connections within our megachurch and the local Atlanta black business networks like a blunt, heavy weapon. He had clearly spent the entire night making frantic, vindictive phone calls, spinning a highly calculated and entirely fabricated narrative about my character. The emails rolling into my inbox from stressed brides, corporate event coordinators, and church social committees all echoed the exact same vicious lies. He told them I routinely stole from client petty cash. He told them I cut severe corners by serving expired ingredients to maximize my own profits. He even went so far as to tell a prominent wedding planner that I had a severe substance abuse problem and was highly unreliable. One email from a senior deaconess explicitly stated she could not support a young woman who was so deeply disrespectful to her elders and engaged in criminal behavior. I watched the notifications roll in on my phone, each one dripping with manufactured outrage. "We cannot have a thief working our charity gala," one read. "Your deposit is forfeit due to breach of moral contract," read another. The sheer speed and ruthlessness of his smear campaign were staggering. He was deliberately attempting to destroy my name, my professional reputation, and my livelihood. He wanted to starve me out aggressively, cutting off my meager catering income to force me back onto his doorstep on my hands and knees, begging for forgiveness and a place to sleep. But he was incredibly foolish. He was fiercely attacking a ghost. I stood in my pristine kitchen sipping a freshly brewed espresso and laughed out loud. The bright, clear sound echoed through the massive empty space of my luxury high-rise. They were frantically canceling gigs on a decoy website. I had deliberately kept the old booking page active precisely because I knew my father would eventually try to attack the only thing he thought I valued. He firmly believed my entire existence depended on those grueling catering gigs. He had absolutely no idea that I was sitting on $80 million in untouchable capital. His vicious, concerted attacks were bouncing harmlessly off an armored tank. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my espresso, thoroughly enjoying the robust flavor, and simply turned my phone on silent. The decoy had served its purpose perfectly. I set my coffee cup down and picked up my phone, dialing the direct line for my commercial real estate broker, David. We met exactly 1 hour later in the private glass-walled conference room of Peach State Wealth Management, overlooking the bustling Atlanta skyline. I slid a sleek black folder across the polished mahogany table. Inside were the complete property records, topographical maps, and current tenant manifests for the Oak Ridge Commercial Park. It was a sprawling 30-acre industrial complex located right on the edge of the city, and it housed the absolute crown jewel of my father's massive ego. Jerome's logistics company, Zenith Freight, operated out of the largest, most prominent warehouse in that exact park. It was the physical proof of his supposed success, the place where he hosted networking events, paraded his expensive leased vehicles, and pretended to be a titan of industry. "I want to buy it," I told David flatly, tapping the thick folder, "the entire park." David reviewed the documents, carefully adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses before raising a skeptical eyebrow. He pulled out a silver pen and tapped it against the paperwork. "The current owners are an old, highly conservative family trust, Kiara. They have held this land for 3 generations. They are not actively looking to sell, and they certainly don't need the liquidity. It will take a massive, unprecedented premium to get them to part with a property generating this much steady passive revenue. You are looking at a highly inflated valuation. Offer them 40% over their highest current market appraisal in pure cash." I instructed, my voice entirely devoid of hesitation or emotion. "I do not care about the premium. I care about the acquisition. Tell them the offer expires in exactly 48 hours and the transaction must be executed immediately through my anonymous shell company. I want absolute discretion, no media announcements, and I want the physical deed in my hands by Friday afternoon." David nodded slowly, recognizing the lethal, unwavering resolve in my tone. Within 2 days, the massive wire transfers cleared without a single hitch. I was officially the sole owner of the Oak Ridge Commercial Park. I owned the pavement my father drove his luxury cars on. I owned the structural roof over his precious logistics empire. And most importantly, I now legally owned his commercial lease. Later that exact same week, Jerome was hosting the monthly meeting of his church deacon board right inside his massive corner office. I knew his schedule perfectly because my mother used to brag about these specific meetings endlessly to her social circle, treating them like royal summits. Jerome loved hosting the esteemed deacons at his warehouse because it allowed him to physically showcase his wealth, his authority, and his status as a grand provider. His office was a testament to his vanity, featuring a massive custom-built oak desk walls lined with framed, meaningless awards and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bustling warehouse floor below. He sat wearing a sharply tailored suit, his gold watch catching the light as he gestured, surrounded by older, influential men who looked up to him as a pillar of the community. He leaned back in his expensive leather executive chair, holding a cup of premium coffee, holding court, like a king holding an audience. We have to stand incredibly firm in our righteous values, gentlemen. Jerome projected his booming voice, dripping with false piety and manufactured sorrow. In business in our community, and especially in our homes, when the younger generation loses their way, when they turn to theft, blatant disrespect, and willful rebellion, we must show them tough love. We cannot coddle sin. We must bravely cut off the dead branches so the rest of the family tree can truly thrive and bear good fruit. He was, of course, talking entirely about me. He was actively painting himself as the tragic, loving, and long-suffering father who was forcibly required to cut off a criminal, ungrateful daughter for the greater good of his family's sterling reputation. He was completely convinced that his ruthless smear campaign had already driven me out of the city in total disgrace. He genuinely thought he had successfully neutralized the threat I posed at the French restaurant by completely destroying my catering reputation. He believed I was currently sitting in some cheap motel, penniless and broken. The deacons nodded in solemn, naive agreement, praising his deep wisdom, his strong leadership, and his unwavering moral compass. Right in the middle of his boastful, hypocritical sermon, a sharp, loud knock interrupted the meeting. A private legal courier dressed in a stark black uniform stepped directly into the office, holding a thick, rigid manila envelope. Jerome frowned heavily at the unwanted interruption, but quickly adjusted his facial expression. He decided to use the moment to show off to the deacons just how crucial and busy his corporate operations were. "Just urgent business matters, gentlemen," Jerome chuckled arrogantly, waving the courier forward with a condescending flick of his wrist. Being the boss means the heavy work never stops. The wheels of industry keep turning even when we are doing the Lord's work. He signed the electronic delivery pad with a large, dramatic flourish, ensuring everyone saw the heavy gold pen he used, and tore open the envelope right in front of his captive, admiring audience. He pulled out the crisp, heavy legal documents, expecting a new shipping contract, a lucrative vendor agreement, or perhaps a city commendation. I had specifically instructed my elite legal team to draft the notice with zero pleasantries, omitting any standard corporate greetings and utilizing maximum legal aggression. As Jerome read the very first paragraph, his arrogant, self-satisfied smile froze, instantly hardening into a mask of pure terror. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin an ashen, sickly gray. His hands began to tremble so violently that the expensive heavy stock paper rattled audibly in the quiet room. The document was a formal, legally binding notification of new ownership from a corporate entity named Peach State Holdings. But the second page contained the real, inescapable devastation. Because Jerome had been struggling financially for years, desperately robbing Peter to pay Paul, he had never secured a long-term commercial lease. He had opted instead for a risky month-to-month agreement to avoid long-term liability and credit checks. It was a fatal business error, a massive vulnerability that I had eagerly exploited. The notice clearly and ruthlessly outlined a mandatory 300% rent increase effective immediately at the start of the next billing cycle. It stipulated that if he failed to sign and agree to the new astronomical financial terms within 24 hours, the document served as a formal, non-negotiable 14-day notice of absolute eviction. The financial demand was mathematically impossible for him to meet. It was designed specifically and meticulously to bankrupt his already struggling, highly leveraged logistics company within a single month. Jerome looked up from the paper, his breathing shallow, rapid, and panicked. The flawless facade of the wealthy, untouchable community leader completely shattered right in front of his most esteemed peers. The deacons stared at him, their expressions shifting from admiration to deep concern as they watched the powerful man physically deflate. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some kind of excuse or explanation, but no words came out. There was only a choked, breathless gasp as he realized the invisible, crushing walls were rapidly closing in, and he had absolutely nowhere to run. The booming voice of the event organizer echoed through the massive ballroom, hanging in the crystal-clear air for a fraction of a second before the reality of his words struck. The elegant string quartet immediately transitioned into a triumphant, sweeping melody. Hundreds of Atlanta's wealthiest elites turned their attention toward the grand staircase, raising their champagne flutes and breaking into rapturous applause. I stood at the top of the marble steps in my custom $15,000 haute couture gown, the heavy diamonds resting against my collarbone, catching the bright flashes of the event photographers. Down on the ballroom floor, Brenda and Nia were completely paralyzed. The malicious, triumphant sneers they had worn just seconds prior melted into expressions of sheer, unadulterated horror. Brenda's hand, which she had forcefully raised to signal the security guards, hung frozen in midair. Her jaw went completely slack. Nia looked as though she had been physically struck by a high-voltage electrical current. Her eyes bulged, darting frantically from the stage to my immaculate gown, her brain entirely failing to process how the sister she had just tried to have thrown onto the street was actually the sovereign host of the entire evening. The head of security, a massive man who Brenda had aggressively commanded to grab me, immediately stepped back, bowed his head respectfully in my direction, and took up a defensive position to ensure no one blocked my path. Jerome looked like he was suffocating. He pulled desperately at the collar of his stiff tuxedo, his face draining of all color. He had spent the entire week calling every contact in the city, attempting to blacklist me from the catering industry, firmly believing he was destroying my life. Now he was standing inside a multi-million-dollar charity gala that I had personally funded with a single stroke of a pen. I descended the marble staircase with slow, deliberate grace, flanked by Marcus and my elite legal team. The sea of wealthy investors, socialites, and politicians parted respectfully to let me through. I did not look at my family. I did not need to. Their profound public humiliation was radiating off them in heavy, suffocating waves. I walked directly toward the main stage, the bright spotlight tracking my every movement. But survival instinct is a powerful, dangerous thing, especially in a cornered rat. DeAndre, always the slick, fast-talking scammer, saw his entire fraudulent empire crumbling before his eyes. He realized instantly that the wealthy investors he had spent the last 2 hours buttering up were now looking at me with absolute reverence. He saw an opening, a desperate, wild pivot to save himself from the millions of dollars in outstanding debt threatening to bury him. Before the event organizer could hand me the microphone, DeAndre violently shoved his way past a group of startled city councilmen. He vaulted up the side steps of the stage, his tuxedo jacket flapping wildly, and snatched the microphone directly from the organizer's hand. He plastered on his signature, aggressively charismatic salesman smile, though the heavy beads of sweat pouring down his forehead betrayed his absolute internal panic. "Ladies and gentlemen, what an incredible surprise!" DeAndre shouted into the microphone, his voice booming over the speaker system with forced manufactured enthusiasm. "Let us give another massive round of applause for my brilliant sister-in-law, Kiara. I told you all we had a massive secret financial backer for our new corporate expansion, and here she is. Kiara is the silent partner and primary capital investor of my cryptocurrency firm. She funded this beautiful gala tonight to celebrate the historic merger of our assets." He gestured wildly toward the crowd of wealthy investors, his eyes wide and manic. "If you want to get in on the ground floor of this unprecedented wealth generation, you need to sign your commitment papers tonight. Kiara and I are taking this entire industry to the absolute top, and we want our closest friends right there with us." The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. Nia, recovering from her initial shock, immediately latched onto her husband's desperate lifeline. She began clapping loudly from the floor, forcing a wide, frantic smile, hoping to validate his claim. Jerome straightened his posture instantly, trying to look like the proud patriarch of a massive, unified business dynasty. They were trying to hijack my moment, attempting to use my undeniable new clout to trap the wealthy investors into funding his rapidly collapsing Ponzi scheme. I did not yell. I did not fight him for the microphone. I simply walked over to the podium, my heels clicking sharply against the polished wood of the stage. Marcus stood completely still at the base of the steps, his arms crossed, watching the pathetic display with icy detachment. I reached out and calmly gripped the microphone stand. DeAndre hesitated, his eyes darting frantically, but he eventually released the microphone, assuming I was about to play along, to save the family face and preserve his fragile illusion. I pulled the microphone from the stand and turned to face the massive crowd. "I am not DeAndre's silent partner," I stated, my voice echoing with absolute uncompromising clarity through the grand ballroom. "I have never invested a single dime in his cryptocurrency firm, and I strongly advise every single person in this room to keep your wallets firmly closed." A collective gasp rippled through the hundreds of attendees. The forced smile on DeAndre's face shattered instantly. He lunged forward to grab the microphone back, but my private security detail materialized out of nowhere, stepping between us and forcing him back with a firm, unyielding physical presence. I turned my gaze up toward the darkened balcony at the back of the room and raised my hand, signaling the AV booth. "Cut the charity slideshow," I commanded. "Show them the reality." Instantly, the soft, inspiring images of charity work vanished from the massive projector screens flanking the main stage. They were replaced by stark, brightly lit spreadsheets, bank statements, and aggressive audit reports. The documents were magnified to be 50 feet tall, impossible for anyone in the room to ignore or misunderstand. "DeAndre's business is not expanding," I declared, pointing directly at the damning financial records illuminating the dark room. "He is running a textbook, highly illegal Ponzi scheme." The documents on these screens are his actual unedited internal corporate audits. He has completely liquidated all of his clients' original capital to fund his own lavish lifestyle and pay off his secondary predatory loans. He has zero liquidity. He has zero actual assets. I looked directly at the cluster of men standing near the center of the room. They were the senior deacons from my father's church, the very men Jerome had been trying to impress earlier in the week. "Take a close look at page 4, gentlemen," I said, my voice slicing through the growing angry murmur of the crowd. "He did not invest your congregation's retirement fund into a secure, high-yield digital asset. He used your church's money to pay the margin call on his own severely over-leveraged personal trading accounts exactly 4 days ago. Your money is entirely gone." Absolute, uncontrollable chaos erupted inside the grand ballroom. The elegant, refined atmosphere completely evaporated in a matter of seconds. The wealthy investors who had been cheerfully drinking champagne just moments before dropped their glasses. The church deacons' men, who usually maintained strict, pious composure, turned completely red with violent fury. "They lied to us," one of the senior deacons bellowed, his voice echoing over the rising din. "He stole the building fund." A swarm of furious, betrayed investors surged forward, abandoning any pretense of high society manners. They aggressively cornered the front of the stage, shouting demands, pointing angry fingers, and threatening immediate, catastrophic legal action. The security guards had to quickly form a tight physical barricade at the base of the stairs to prevent a full-scale riot. Brenda, who had spent her entire adult life carefully curating an image of untouchable suburban perfection, completely lost her grip on reality. She collapsed against a high cocktail table, knocking over a towering arrangement of expensive champagne flutes. She sobbed loudly and incoherently as the wealthy society women she had spent years trying to impress looked down at her with undisguised pity and revulsion. DeAndre backed away from the edge of the stage, his eyes wide with animalistic terror. He was entirely trapped. His lies were fully exposed, projected in high definition for the entire financial elite of Atlanta to scrutinize. He looked down at the furious mob demanding his immediate arrest, then looked over at his family for help. Jerome, the man who constantly preached about family unity, strength, and facing adversity, like a man, did not step forward to defend his golden son-in-law. Instead, the moment Jerome realized the furious church deacons were looking around the room for anyone associated with the scam, he physically ducked behind a large imported floral arrangement. I watched from the stage with grim satisfaction as my father practically crawled along the edge of the ballroom wall, desperately trying to sneak out the side exit to avoid any association with the massive, very public felony he had just proudly endorsed. He was abandoning his family to save his own skin. DeAndre realized he was completely alone. With the angry crowd surging forward and threatening to breach the security line, sheer panic fully overrode his senses. He turned and sprinted toward the back of the stage, shoving his way past a confused lighting technician, and fled blindly through the swinging kitchen service doors, abandoning the gala, his investors, and his wife in a frantic, cowardly sprint into the humid night. Back at my parents' sprawling, heavily mortgaged suburban house, the elegant facade of the evening had completely disintegrated into raw, feral desperation. Nia had fled the gala shortly after her husband's speeding home in a blind panic. Her breath came in ragged, hyperventilating gasps. The walls of her meticulously decorated, heavily leveraged life were caving in. She knew DeAndre was ruined, and by extension, so was she. The federal authorities would be freezing their accounts by morning. She needed liquid assets. She needed survival money to facilitate a rapid escape. She tore through the house like a wild animal, ripping drawers completely out of their tracks and dumping their contents onto the expensive hardwood floors. Finding nothing of immediate value in the bedrooms, she sprinted into the humid, cluttered garage, frantically tearing through old, dusty storage boxes, looking for forgotten jewelry, spare cash, or anything she could easily pawn before the police arrived. She ripped the packing tape off a heavy cardboard box, aggressively throwing aside winter coats and old holiday decorations. In her frantic haste, her arm caught the edge of a stack of plastic storage bins tucked away in the corner. The bins tumbled over, crashing onto the concrete floor and spilling their contents everywhere. It was a box of my old catering supplies, a forgotten relic of my past life that I had left behind when they threw me out on the street. Stacks of old diner receipts, stained aprons, and unused catering invoices scattered across the dirty floor. Nia cursed loudly, kicking at the pile of my old belongings in sheer frustration. But as she turned to continue her frantic search, something caught her eye. It was a piece of paper that had fluttered out from between the pages of an old, battered recipe book. It was slightly crumpled, clearly a hastily made photocopy tucked away for safekeeping. Nia stooped down and snatched the paper off the concrete. She smoothed out the creases, her eyes scanning the printed text in the dim garage light. Her breath caught violently in her throat. The frantic, terrified energy in her body instantly vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating stillness. It was an official lottery verification receipt. The numbers printed across the top perfectly matched the historic, record-breaking drawing from the previous month. The payout amount listed at the bottom was a staggering, incomprehensible $80 million. But what caused Nia's eyes to widen with a dark, maniacal greed was the name printed clearly on the official claimant line, Kiara. Nia stared at the photocopied slip of paper, the realization hitting her like a speeding freight train. I was not just a successful businesswoman who had secured a wealthy benefactor, I was the sole winner of the Mega Millions jackpot. The sheer magnitude of the wealth shifted something deep and fundamentally broken within her mind. A twisted, malicious smile slowly stretched across her face in the dark garage. They did not need to run from their debts. They just needed to take what rightfully belonged to the family. Nia did not hesitate for a single second. She clutched the crumpled photocopy of the $80 million lottery receipt. So tightly, her knuckles turned white, her heart hammering against her ribs, fueled by a toxic cocktail of adrenaline and pure, unadulterated greed. She abandoned the torn boxes of my old catering supplies and sprinted out of the humid garage, bursting through the heavy fire door into the immaculate kitchen of the suburban house. In the living room, the atmosphere was suffocating and bleak. Brenda was pacing frantically across the imported rug, still wearing her ruined gala gown, muttering under her breath about the total social destruction they had just endured. Jerome was standing by the crystal decanters, his hands shaking violently as he poured a massive glass of scotch. He looked completely broken, a defeated patriarch, waiting for the federal authorities to knock on his door and drag his golden son-in-law away in handcuffs. Nia did not care about the disastrous gala anymore. She did not care about the angry deacons, the exposed Ponzi scheme, or their shattered public image. She marched directly up to the polished mahogany bar and slammed the crumpled piece of paper flat against the wood. "Look at this," Nia commanded, her voice trembling with manic, vibrating intensity. "Look at the date. Look at the name. Jerome scowled, irritated by the loud interruption to his wallowing. He set his glass down heavily and leaned over the paper, squinting at the faded ink. Brenda stopped pacing and drifted over her tear-streaked face, peering over his broad shoulder. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound in the sprawling house was the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Then the realization hit them with the force of a physical blow. The date printed on the official lottery verification receipt was unmistakable. It was exactly 1 week before Jerome had forcefully thrown me out of his house. It was a week before he had changed the locks, thrown my meager belongings onto the front lawn, and told me I was entirely dead to him. $80 million! Brenda gasped loudly, her manicured hands flying to cover her mouth. She is a billionaire. Brenda whispered the word, tasting completely foreign on her tongue. Our daughter is a multi-millionaire. She is a thief. Jerome corrected his voice, dropping to a dangerous, gravelly register. The despair and humiliation of the evening completely vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden, aggressive burst of righteous indignation. His posture straightened, his chest puffing out as he snatched the paper from the counter. His eyes gleamed with a dark, predatory light. That ticket was bought when she lived here, under my roof, eating my food. That is family money. The narrative shifted instantly in his mind. He was no longer the disgraced father who had backed a fraudulent criminal. He was a victim. He was a hard-working, loving provider who had been viciously robbed by a deceitful, ungrateful daughter. He convinced himself of this new reality within seconds. I had not earned that wealth. I had stolen their collective destiny. We need to sue her, Naya declared, her eyes wide with frantic, calculating greed. We need to take it all back. She used our house as her base of operations. She used the money she saved while living rent-free to buy that ticket. It belongs to us. DeAndre's debts are absolutely nothing compared to $80 million. We can crush her. Jerome did not waste time mourning the events of the gala. By the following morning, he was sitting in the ostentatious, aggressively decorated office of Marshall Vance. Marshall was a notoriously sleazy, high-profile attorney whose face plastered half the billboards in downtown Atlanta. He specialized in high-stakes civil litigation, nasty corporate divorces, and specifically contested lottery disputes. He was a legal shark who thrived in the murky waters of family betrayals and disputed wealth, demanding massive contingency fees in exchange for absolute courtroom ruthlessness. Jerome laid the photocopied receipt directly on Marshall's glass desk. My daughter stole the family lottery ticket, Jerome lied without a single flinch or hesitation in his voice. We have a family syndicate, a binding verbal agreement. Every single week, we all put cash into a bowl on the kitchen counter, and Kiara was responsible for going to the gas station to buy the tickets for the group. When she finally hit the jackpot, she packed her bags in the middle of the night, abandoned her loving family, and claimed the prize entirely for herself. Marshall leaned back in his plush leather chair, steepling his fingers together. He did not care if the story was true. He only cared if it was legally actionable. He saw the massive payout figure on the receipt and smelled blood in the water. A verbal family syndicate agreement is a highly recognized legal precedent in the state of Georgia. Marshall purred, his smile resembling a razor blade. If we can establish a pattern of shared household expenses and collective financial goals during the time she resided in your home, we can file a massive civil lawsuit for breach of contract, unjust enrichment, and civil fraud. We will go after the entire principal amount plus maximum punitive damages. Do it, Jerome ordered, his voice hard and uncompromising. I want every single asset she possesses frozen immediately. I want her dragged through the mud. I want her to feel exactly what she made my family feel last night. Marshall Vance knew that lawsuits of this magnitude were won in the court of public opinion long before they ever reached a judge. He immediately drafted a sensational, highly aggressive civil complaint and filed it with the Fulton County Superior Court. But he did not stop there. He intentionally leaked the entire lawsuit, along with the scandalous details of the $80 million jackpot, directly to the local Atlanta news networks. By Tuesday evening, my face was plastered across every television screen in the city. Channel 4 News ran an exclusive primetime special featuring a sit-down interview with my parents. The performance they delivered was worthy of a masterclass in manipulation. Brenda sat on a plush sofa clutching a crumpled tissue, her makeup carefully applied to look exhausted and heartbroken. We gave her everything, Brenda sobbed, for the cameras, her voice cracking with manufactured grief. We supported her catering dreams when nobody else would. We opened our home to her. We pooled our money every single week for the lottery, dreaming of the day we could all finally achieve financial freedom together as a family. And when our numbers finally hit, our own daughter vanished in the dead of night. She took our collective dream and ran. Jerome sat next to her, his arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders, playing the role of the stoic, deeply wounded father. "It breaks a father's heart," Jerome told the reporter, looking directly into the camera lens with absolute chilling conviction. "You raise a child to share your values, to understand that family always comes first. To see her use stolen family money to fund a lavish lifestyle while simultaneously trying to ruin her brother-in-law's legitimate business at a charity gala, it is an unparalleled level of treachery. We just want what rightfully belongs to the family syndicate. We just want justice." The local news anchor ate it up, framing the story as a tragic tale of sudden wealth destroying a hard-working, respectable suburban family. They interviewed neighbors who had seen me carrying out my catering supplies, framing it as my secretive, hurried escape. They interviewed members of the church congregation who expressed absolute shock at my supposed greed. DeAndre even made a brief appearance standing solemnly behind my parents, suddenly transformed into the innocent victim of a vindictive billionaire sister-in-law who had maliciously used her stolen wealth to sabotage his corporate reputation. The public narrative shifted with violent speed. I was no longer the brilliant, anonymous benefactor who had exposed a massive Ponzi scheme. I was a greedy, treacherous villain. Social media erupted with outrage directed entirely at me. My old catering business pages were flooded with hateful comments. The smear campaign Jerome had attempted earlier in the week was absolutely nothing compared to the highly coordinated, legally sanctioned character assassination playing out on live television. I was sitting behind the massive mahogany desk in my private office at Peach State Wealth Management, ignoring the relentless ringing of my phone. Marcus was pacing the length of the room, his phone pressed tightly to his ear, as he furiously barked orders at our crisis management team. We knew the lawsuit was coming the moment the news segment aired, but we severely underestimated the speed and sheer audacity of Marshall Vance's legal maneuvers. The heavy oak door of my office swung open abruptly, bypassing my executive assistant entirely. A man in a plain beige suit stepped into the room holding a thick stack of legal documents bound with a heavy blue clip. He walked directly up to my desk and dropped the papers heavily onto the polished wood. "Kiara, you are officially served," the man stated flatly, turning on his heel and walking out just as quickly as he had entered. I stared down at the documents, my heart performing a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. I reached out and pulled the thick stack toward me, flipping past the initial civil complaint detailing the fabricated family syndicate. My eyes locked onto the second document in the stack, bearing the official seal of a Fulton County Superior Court judge. It was an ex parte temporary injunction. Marshall Vance had leveraged the sensational media coverage, the fabricated emotional testimony of my parents, and a highly sympathetic, publicity-hungry judge to secure an immediate, devastating legal strike. The order was clear and uncompromising. Pending a full evidentiary hearing to determine the validity of the family syndicate claim, the court was taking extreme protective measures to prevent the dissipation of contested assets. I read the specific legal clauses, the blood rushing loudly in my ears. The injunction ordered an immediate total freeze on all of my public-facing personal and business bank accounts. My primary checking accounts, my operational capital for the commercial park acquisition, and the visible investment portfolios I utilized for daily transactions were entirely locked down. I could not transfer funds. I could not execute massive trades. I could not even withdraw cash from an ATM without violating a direct federal court order. For a brief, agonizing second, the sheer weight of their malicious strategy pressed down on me. My family had successfully weaponized the legal system to cut off my oxygen supply. They had publicly branded me a thief, frozen my accessible wealth, and backed me into a terrifying legal corner. Across the city, sitting in Marshall Vance's luxurious conference room, Jerome, Brenda, Nia, and DeAndre were raising glasses of expensive champagne. They watched the confirmation of the asset freeze roll across the lawyer's computer screen, their faces illuminated by the bright glow of the monitor. They cheered loudly, completely intoxicated by their own ruthless brilliance. They had successfully ambushed me. They had cut off my resources and destroyed my reputation in a single perfectly coordinated strike. For that one brief shining second, the family truly believed they had won. The Autumn Promise. Gala was historically the most anticipated charity event of the Atlanta social season. It was a night of extreme excess masquerading as philanthropy, a place where the city's elite gathered to drink expensive champagne network and pretend they cared about the less fortunate. This year, the gala was being held at the Grand Ballroom of the St. Regis, and Nia and DeAndre had somehow managed to secure the positions of primary hosts. They were utilizing the entire event as a massive, highly coordinated scam. DeAndre's cryptocurrency firm was a sinking ship, a textbook Ponzi scheme desperately bleeding cash. He owed millions of dollars to dangerous, impatient creditors. The gala was entirely designed to lure in wealthy, unsuspecting investors under the noble guise of charity, allowing DeAndre to aggressively pitch his fraudulent financial products and siphon off the donated funds to cover his mounting personal debts. Nia stood near the grand entrance of the ballroom wearing a rented, heavily sequined silver gown that pinched her waist uncomfortably. She was scanning the crowd with anxious, greedy eyes. She was waiting for the perfect opportunity to secure a new investor, but she was also eagerly waiting for me. She firmly expected me to arrive at the service entrance wearing a cheap, ill-fitting uniform, desperate for the minimum wage payout she had cruelly dangled in front of me. She had explicitly instructed the hotel's security team to humiliate the new bathroom attendant upon arrival. But I was not at the service entrance. Exactly 1 hour after the event began, a sleek, armored Maybach pulled up to the red carpet at the main entrance. A team of 4 elite, highly trained private security contractors stepped out first, swiftly forming a protective perimeter around the vehicle. The valet staff stepped back in awe as the rear door opened. I stepped onto the red carpet. I was not wearing a uniform. I was wearing a custom-tailored $15,000 haute couture gown made of deep, midnight blue silk. The fabric cascaded around me like liquid glass. A flawless 50-carat diamond necklace rested heavily against my collarbone, catching the brilliant flashes of the paparazzi's cameras. Flanking me on either side were Marcus, looking exceptionally sharp in a bespoke tuxedo, and the 2 senior partners of my ruthless corporate legal team. We moved with the undeniable gravitational pull of supreme, untouchable wealth. The grand doors swung open and we entered the ballroom. The sheer magnitude of my presence instantly disrupted the atmosphere. The lively chatter died down rapidly as heads turned, guests pausing mid-sentence to stare at the breathtaking display of power and luxury walking through their midst. Brenda and Nia were standing near the center ice sculpture, desperately trying to corner a wealthy real estate developer. Brenda saw me first. Her eyes widened so far they nearly popped out of her skull. The champagne flute slipped from her fingers, shattering against the marble floor, but she did not even flinch. She grabbed Nia's arm, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging painfully into her daughter's skin. Nia turned, irritation flashing across her face, but the expression instantly melted into pure, unadulterated shock when she saw me. She stared at the diamonds around my neck, her brain completely short-circuiting. Her mouth opened and closed silently like a dying fish. She had expected a broken, destitute sister begging for scraps. Instead, she was looking at a queen. The initial shock rapidly mutated into a violent, aggressive panic. Brenda's face flushed a deep, ugly shade of purple. She truly believed this was an elaborate, psychotic stunt to ruin their crucial networking event. She frantically flagged down the head of the St. Regis security team, a massive, imposing man with an earpiece. "What is she doing here?" Brenda hissed loudly, pointing a trembling finger directly at me. "She is not on the guest list. She is an imposter. Grab that trash and toss her on the street immediately. She is trying to ruin our charity event." Nia quickly joined the frantic chorus, her voice rising in pitch. "Yes, throw her out right now. She is a low-level caterer causing a disturbance. Remove her before we cancel our contract with this hotel." The security director took a step forward, his hand instinctively reaching toward his radio, prepared to execute the host's aggressive command. But before he could even take a second step toward me, a sharp, piercing whine of feedback echoed through the massive ballroom speakers, completely silencing the room. The main event organizer, a nervous, sweating man holding a clipboard, had practically sprinted up the stairs of the main stage. He gripped the microphone stand tightly, his eyes darting toward the back of the room where I stood surrounded by my elite team. He completely ignored Brenda's frantic screaming commands. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I please have your immediate attention?" The organizer announced, his voice echoing loudly across the silent, captivated crowd. "We have a highly unexpected, unprecedented alteration to tonight's program." Brenda froze, her hands still raised in the air, pointing at me. Nia stopped breathing. The security director paused, sensing a massive shift in the power dynamic. This magnificent evening of philanthropy was initially organized by our host committee. The organizer continued, his voice trembling slightly with awe. "However, exactly 48 hours ago, the entire financial structure of this gala was completely acquired. Ladies and gentlemen, please direct your attention to the main entrance and welcome our anonymous platinum benefactor. She is the sole exclusive sponsor who personally funded this entire venue, covered every single expense tonight, and generously secured the future of our youth charity." The organizer took a deep breath, pointing directly at me. "Please welcome Miss Kiara." The entire ballroom erupted into deafening, thunderous applause. The wealthy elite of Atlanta turned toward me, their faces filled with profound respect and admiration. Brenda's legs completely gave out. She collapsed heavily against a cocktail table, gasping for air, as the reality of her absolute powerlessness crushed her. Nia stood completely paralyzed, her face draining to an ashen, sickly gray. The security director, realizing exactly who he had almost touched, immediately stepped back and bowed his head in deep respect, taking up a defensive position to ensure no one blocked my path. I did not look at my mother or my sister. I simply smiled, a cold, lethal expression of absolute victory, and began my slow, deliberate walk toward the stage. The applause washed over me, a physical validation of my untouchable status. But as I reached the base of the stairs, the atmosphere violently shifted. DeAndre, always the slick, desperate scammer, saw his entire fraudulent empire crumbling before his eyes. He realized instantly that the wealthy investors he had spent the evening buttering up were now looking at me with absolute reverence. He saw an opening, a wild, reckless pivot to save himself from the millions of dollars in debt threatening to bury him. He shoved his way past a group of startled city councilmen, vaulting up the side steps of the stage. He snatched the microphone directly from the organizer's hand, plastering on his signature, aggressively charismatic salesman smile, though heavy beads of sweat poured down his panicked face. "Ladies and gentlemen, what an incredible surprise!" DeAndre shouted, his voice booming with forced manufactured enthusiasm. "Let us give another massive round of applause for my brilliant sister-in-law, Kiara. I told you all we had a massive secret financial backer for our corporate expansion, and here she is. Kiara is the silent partner and primary capital investor of my cryptocurrency firm." He gestured wildly toward the crowd of wealthy investors, his eyes wide and manic. "She funded this gala to celebrate the historic merger of our assets. If you want to get in on the ground floor of this unprecedented wealth generation, you need to sign your commitment papers tonight. Kiara and I are taking this entire industry to the absolute top." The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. Nia, recovering from her initial shock, immediately latched onto her husband's desperate lifeline, clapping loudly from the floor. Jerome straightened his posture, trying to look like the proud patriarch of a unified business dynasty. They were trying to hijack my moment, attempting to use my new clout to trap investors into his collapsing Ponzi scheme. I calmly walked up the stairs and approached the podium, I did not yell. I simply reached out and gripped the microphone stand. DeAndre hesitated, but eventually released it, assuming I was about to play along to save the family face. I pulled the microphone from the stand and turned to face the massive crowd. "I am not DeAndre's silent partner," I stated, my voice echoing with absolute uncompromising clarity. "I have never invested a single dime in his firm, and I strongly advise every person in this room to keep your wallets firmly closed." A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. The forced smile on DeAndre's face shattered instantly. He lunged forward, but my private security detail materialized out of nowhere, forcing him back with an unyielding physical presence. I turned my gaze toward the darkened balcony and raised my hand. "Cut the charity slideshow," I commanded. "Show them the reality." Instantly, the inspiring images of charity work vanished from the massive projector screens. They were replaced by stark, brightly lit spreadsheets, bank statements, and aggressive audit reports magnified to 50 feet tall. DeAndre's business is not expanding, I declared, pointing at the damning financial records. He is running a textbook Ponzi scheme. These documents are his actual unedited internal corporate audits. He has completely liquidated all of his clients' original capital to fund his own lavish lifestyle and pay off predatory loans. He has zero actual assets. I looked directly at the cluster of senior deacons from my father's church standing near the center of the room. "Take a close look at page 4, gentlemen," I said, my voice slicing through the growing murmur. "He used your church's building fund to pay the margin call on his own over-leveraged personal trading accounts exactly 4 days ago. Your money is entirely gone." Absolute, uncontrollable chaos erupted. The elegant atmosphere completely evaporated. The wealthy investors dropped their champagne glasses. The church deacons turned completely red with violent fury. "He stole the building fund," one deacon bellowed. A swarm of furious, betrayed investors surged forward aggressively, cornering the front of the stage, shouting demands and threatening immediate, catastrophic legal action. The security guards had to form a tight barricade to prevent a full-scale riot. DeAndre backed away from the edge of the stage, his eyes wide with animalistic terror. He looked down at the furious mob, then looked over at his family for help. Jerome, the man who constantly preached about facing adversity physically, ducked behind a large floral arrangement. He practically crawled along the edge of the ballroom wall, desperately sneaking out the side exit to avoid any association with the massive felony he had just proudly endorsed. Realizing he was completely alone, sheer panic overrode DeAndre's senses. He sprinted toward the back of the stage, shoved his way past a confused lighting technician, and fled blindly through the swinging kitchen service doors, sprinting into the humid night. Back at my parents' sprawling suburban house, the elegant facade of the evening had completely disintegrated into raw, feral desperation. Nia had fled the gala shortly after her husband speeding home in a blind panic. Her breath came in ragged gasps. She knew DeAndre was ruined, and the federal authorities would be freezing their accounts by morning. She desperately needed liquid assets to facilitate a rapid escape. She tore through the house like a wild animal, dumping drawers onto the hardwood floors. Finding nothing of immediate value, she sprinted into the cluttered garage, frantically tearing through old storage boxes, looking for anything she could easily pawn. She aggressively threw aside winter coats, her arm catching the edge of a stack of plastic storage bins. The bins tumbled over, crashing onto the concrete floor. It was a box of my old catering supplies left behind when they threw me out on the street. Stacks of old diner receipts and stained aprons scattered across the floor. Nia cursed loudly, kicking at the pile in sheer frustration. But as she turned to continue her frantic search, something caught her eye. It was a slightly crumpled, photocopied piece of paper that had fluttered out of an old recipe book. Nia snatched the paper off the concrete, her eyes scanning the printed text. Her breath caught violently in her throat. The frantic energy instantly vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating stillness. It was an official lottery verification receipt. The payout amount listed at the bottom was a staggering $80 million. But what caused Nia's eyes to widen with a dark, maniacal greed was the name printed clearly on the official claimant line: Kiara. The illusion of their victory lasted exactly 72 hours. They believed freezing my public accounts had rendered me defenseless, fundamentally misunderstanding the difference between newly acquired cash and deeply entrenched institutional power. My elite legal team did not panic. They simply smiled, filed an emergency motion for an expedited discovery deposition, and prepared to dismantle my family under oath. The deposition commences. The red recording light on the videographer's camera blinked with a steady rhythmic pulse. The conference room inside my legal team's downtown Atlanta skyscraper was freezing, designed specifically to keep adversaries physically uncomfortable. I sat perfectly still in a tailored charcoal blazer, my posture relaxed and unbothered. Flanking me were Marcus, radiating silent intimidation, and my lead corporate litigator, Arthur Sterling. Arthur possessed the chilling, polite demeanor of a man who destroyed generational wealth for sport. Across the massive glass table sat the opposition. Jerome wore a flashy, aggressively tailored suit that screamed of newly acquired debt. He leaned back in his leather chair, practically vibrating with smug, patriarchal confidence. Brenda sat beside him, actively dabbing at perfectly dry eyes with a crumpled tissue, already rehearsing her heartbroken victim routine for the legal record. Marshall Vance. Their billboard-famous attorney flashed a predatory, grease-slicked grin as he organized his fabricated files. They truly believed they held all the cards. They truly believed the temporary injunction freezing my public accounts had rendered me entirely defenseless. They failed to realize they had just walked into an execution chamber. Constructing the timeline. Arthur Sterling adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses, completely ignoring Marshall Vance's theatrical posturing. He focused his icy gaze entirely on my father. "Mr. Wilson." Arthur began, his voice smooth and dangerously quiet. "You have stated under oath that a binding family syndicate existed. You claim this syndicate was funded by shared household resources while your daughter resided under your roof. Is this correct?" "Absolutely," Jerome barked, adjusting his expensive tie. "We pooled our money every single week. It was a family rule. She lived in my house, ate the food I provided, and used my resources to buy those tickets. That makes the winnings family property." Arthur nodded slowly, making a precise note on his legal pad. "Let us establish the exact timeline of events on the specific Tuesday the winning lottery ticket was purchased. You have stated previously that you and your daughter had a disagreement that day." Jerome sneered, sitting forward. "It was not a disagreement. It was a disciplinary action. She was disrespecting my authority, so I took decisive action to protect my household." "And what specific action did you take, Mr. Wilson?" Arthur pressed mildly. "I kicked her out." Jerome stated, his chest puffing up with arrogant pride, eager to establish his absolute dominance on the official video record. "I told her to pack her garbage and leave. I confiscated her house keys directly from her hands. I locked the front door, and I explicitly told her she was no longer welcome on my property." Arthur looked up, his pen hovering. "And for the official record, Mr. Wilson, at what exact time did you physically remove Kiara from your property, confiscate her keys, and sever her access to your household resources?" Jerome did not hesitate. 10 o'clock in the morning, exactly 10 a.m. I checked my watch when I locked the deadbolt. "You are certain?" Arthur asked. "You are under oath, Mr. Wilson." "I am absolutely certain," Jerome snapped, glaring at me across the table. 10 in the morning. She was off my property and cut off from the family. Dismantling the illusion. Arthur turned his attention to Brenda, who immediately sniffled and sat up straighter, preparing for her performance. "Mrs. Wilson, you submitted a sworn affidavit claiming you actively funded Kiara's catering business out of deep maternal love, and therefore her financial assets are intertwined with yours." Brenda placed a trembling hand over her heart. "I gave that girl everything. I funded her little cooking dreams. Every dime she had came from the love and support of her parents." Arthur slid a single sheet of paper across the glass table. "Then perhaps you can explain this bank record, Mrs. Wilson. It shows that at exactly 9 a.m. on that very same Tuesday, 1 hour before your husband physically threw your daughter onto the street, you logged into a joint collegiate checking account and completely drained Kiara's entire life savings of $4,000. You left her with a balance of 0. Did you drain her account out of maternal love?" Brenda's fake tears vanished instantly. The blood drained from her face. She looked at Marshall Vance in sheer panic. Vance frowned, holding up a hand. "My client was simply securing household expenses," Vance interjected smoothly. "The account was joint." "Household expenses," Arthur repeated dryly. He tapped the paper. The transaction was a direct wire transfer to a luxury car dealership in Buckhead for a down payment on a new Mercedes for your son-in-law, DeAndre. Brenda stammered incoherently, her jaw working up and down but no sound emerging. Jerome glared at her, completely unaware she had stolen my money to fund DeAndre's fraudulent lifestyle. The cracks in their unified front were already forming. The trap springs. Arthur did not give them a single second to recover. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a heavy, transparent evidence folder. "Mr. Wilson?" Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave, losing all traces of politeness. "You have sworn under oath that the winning lottery ticket was purchased using family funds, specifically while Kiara was acting as an agent of your household." Jerome rallied, sticking out his chin. "That is right. She took our money from the kitchen bowl that morning." Arthur slid the evidence folder across the table. "This is a certified, digitally encrypted terminal receipt obtained directly from the Georgia Lottery Commission via federal subpoena. It details the exact transaction history of the winning Mega Millions ticket." Marshall Vance leaned forward, suddenly looking very nervous. He snatched the folder and read the highlighted text. His slick, greasy smile completely evaporated. "Read the timestamp, Mr. Vance," Arthur commanded. "Read it out loud for the video record." Vance swallowed hard, a bead of sweat forming on his forehead. 2:15 p.m., he mumbled. Arthur turned back to Jerome. "The winning ticket was purchased at exactly 2:15 p.m., Mr. Wilson, over 4 hours after you swore under oath that you had physically removed Kiara from your property, confiscated her keys, and severed all ties. Furthermore, the receipt proves the ticket was purchased entirely in cash." Jerome looked like he had been struck by a speeding freight train. He looked wildly at his lawyer, demanding an explanation, but Vance was staring at the document in silent horror. "Let me explain exactly where that cash came from," Arthur stated, his voice ringing through the cold room like a judge delivering a sentence. "After your wife drained her bank account, and after you threw her on the street at 10 a.m., my client had $0 to her name. She walked 3 miles to a local diner where she had previously delivered catering samples. She begged the owner to let her wash dishes and prep food for the lunch rush just to earn enough money to eat. The owner gave her a $20 bill as a tip at 2 p.m. She walked next door to the gas station and bought the ticket at 2:15 p.m. Arthur leaned forward, planting his hands firmly on the glass table. "Your fabricated family syndicate is a chronological and geographical impossibility. My client bought that ticket with her own hard-earned cash hours after you legally and physically severed her from your household. You have just committed perjury on a recorded legal record." The fatal flaw. Complete suffocating silence descended upon the conference room. Brenda was visibly shaking. Jerome's arrogant posture collapsed entirely. His mouth opened, but his vocal cords refused to function. He had trapped himself in his own web of malicious lies. But Arthur Sterling was not finished. A true corporate shark never stops when the prey is merely bleeding. They strike until the prey is entirely consumed. Arthur calmly reached into his briefcase one final time. He withdrew a thick-bound stack of financial documents. These were the documents Jerome had proudly and voluntarily submitted to the court during the initial filing to prove he possessed the vast wealth necessary to fund a high-stakes family lottery syndicate. Jerome had wanted to look like a millionaire to the judge. Arthur flipped the binder open. His finger traced a line of highlighted figures. A slow, dangerous smile stretched across Arthur's face. It was the smile of a predator admiring a perfectly executed kill. "Mr. Wilson," Arthur said softly, his eyes glinting with lethal amusement, "I must thank you for voluntarily submitting your private offshore bank statements into the public court record. It was a remarkably bold legal strategy." Marshall Vance's head snapped up. He looked at the documents, then at Jerome, sheer panic contorting his features. "What are those?" Vance demanded, his voice cracking. I did not review those specific statements. My client submitted those independently to the clerk. Arthur ignored the panicking lawyer. Mr. Wilson, these offshore statements from the Cayman Islands show a highly interesting pattern. Over the last 5 years, they document over $4 million in untraceable, undocumented cash deposits. Jerome's face turned the color of wet cement. He gripped the edge of the glass table so hard his knuckles turned white. His breathing became shallow, rapid, and erratic. These are fascinating figures, Arthur continued mercilessly. Especially considering I pulled the official corporate tax returns for your logistics company this morning. According to your federal filings, your company operates at a marginal loss. You reported an annual personal income of exactly $85,000. The air in the room grew completely stagnant. Brenda looked at her husband in absolute, uncomprehending horror. She had no idea about the hidden millions. She only knew they were currently drowning in debt. Mr. Wilson, Arthur said, his voice echoing loudly in the silent room. You have just voluntarily submitted irrefutable sworn proof of massive systematic federal tax evasion and corporate money laundering into a public legal record. The $4 million sitting in these offshore accounts constitutes unreported, untaxed income. The collapse, the realization hit Jerome with catastrophic force. In his desperate, arrogant attempt to fake his wealth to steal my $80 million lottery ticket, he had actively handed the court the exact evidence the Internal Revenue Service needed to send him to federal prison for a decade. He had proudly engineered his own total destruction. Marshal Vance reacted with the violent speed of a cornered rat. The sleazy attorney understood exactly what was happening. If he remained attached to a client actively committing perjury and voluntarily submitting evidence of federal tax evasion, his own legal license and freedom were in immediate jeopardy. Vance violently shoved his chair back. The metal legs screeched agonizingly against the polished floor. He frantically shoved his fabricated files into his leather briefcase, snapping the latches shut with trembling hands. "We are done here," Vance shouted, addressing the videographer rather than his clients. "Stop the recording. This deposition is officially concluded." Jerome reached out, grabbing Vance's sleeve in sheer desperation. "Marshal, wait. You have to fix this. We have a contract. You have to protect me." Vance ripped his arm away from Jerome as if my father were covered in toxic acid. "I am not protecting you from the federal government, Jerome. I am officially resigning as your legal counsel, effective immediately. I withdraw from this case. Do not call my office. Do not contact me again." Without another word, Marshal Vance sprinted out of the conference room, the heavy oak doors slamming shut behind him, leaving my parents entirely alone. I sat perfectly still, watching my father suffocate under the weight of his own arrogance. He looked at the offshore bank statements, then looked up at me. There was no rage left in his eyes. There was no patriarchal dominance. There was only the raw, hollow terror of a man who realized he had just lost absolutely everything. The absolute silence in the conference room was shattered only by the sound of Jerome's ragged, panicked breathing. He stared at the offshore bank statements, his mind desperately trying to rewind time to unsubmit the damning documents. But the trap had already snapped shut with bone-crushing finality. My legal team did not gloat. Arthur Sterling simply gathered his papers, placed them neatly into his leather briefcase, and stood up. We left my parents sitting alone in the freezing room, entirely paralyzed by the catastrophic reality of their own hubris. The fallout was instantaneous and utterly merciless. By 9 o'clock the following morning, Arthur filed a motion to dismiss the civil lawsuit, attaching the certified video deposition and the unredacted offshore bank statements as primary exhibits. The Fulton County Superior Court judge, the very same judge who had been manipulated by Marshal Vance's theatrical media circus just days prior, reviewed the submission. Recognizing blatant perjury and a fabricated claim, the judge dismissed the lawsuit with prejudice. They could never sue me for the lottery winnings again. But the dismissal was merely the opening tremor of a massive, unstoppable avalanche. The true danger of the American legal system is that civil courts and federal agencies do not operate in isolated silos. When Arthur Sterling legally entered evidence of a $4 million offshore tax evasion scheme into the public court record, It triggered an automatic, unavoidable, automated alert. The Internal Revenue Service's Criminal Investigation Division operates with ruthless mechanical precision. They do not care about family drama. They do not care about social status. They only care about unreported income. Less than 48 hours after the deposition, a fleet of black unmarked government SUVs descended upon Jerome's logistics company headquarters. Dozens of federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with IRSCID emblazoned across the back swarmed the facility. They did not knock politely. They breached the glass front doors with federal warrants in hand, instantly locking down the entire building. Employees were ordered to step away from their computers. Communication networks were severed. Federal investigators began systematically carrying out hundreds of cardboard boxes filled with physical invoices, client ledgers, and offshore routing numbers. Cybersecurity agents cloned every single hard drive on the premises, capturing every deleted email and hidden spreadsheet Jerome had desperately tried to erase over the last 5 years. Simultaneously, a second heavily armed federal strike team breached the downtown Atlanta high-rise that housed DeAndre's cryptocurrency firm. But DeAndre's office was already a ghost town. The furious investors from the charity gala had already filed mass fraud reports with the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the walls of his Ponzi scheme had completely caved in. DeAndre knew the feds were coming. He possessed the highly tuned survival instincts of a career criminal. While Nia was frantically pacing the floors of my parents' house, desperately waiting for her husband to devise a brilliant legal defense, DeAndre was abandoning her entirely. He had rushed to a hidden safety deposit box, stuffing a black canvas duffel bag with $250,000 in tightly banded cash and a secondary passport he had secured months ago for exactly this scenario. He completely abandoned his phone, knowing it could be tracked, and hailed a cash-only taxi to Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. His goal was simple: board a direct flight to the Caribbean, disappear into a non-extradition country, and leave his wife and her family to face the federal indictments alone. DeAndre moved quickly through the crowded international terminal, keeping his head down and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He bypassed the automated kiosks and paid cash for a one-way first-class ticket to Nassau, Bahamas. His heart hammered violently against his ribs as he successfully navigated the TSA security checkpoint, blending in with the oblivious tourists. He reached Gate E14, gripping the strap of his cash-filled duffel bag, his eyes glued to the digital departure board. Boarding would commence in exactly 10 minutes. He tasted the salty, metallic tang of freedom. DeAndre Henderson. The voice came from directly behind him. It was not a question. It was a command. DeAndre spun around. 4 men in unassuming business casual attire had silently formed a tight, inescapable perimeter around him. 2 uniformed Customs and Border Protection officers stood just a few feet away, blocking his only exit path. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud securities. Fraud and interstate flight to avoid prosecution." The lead agent stated, his voice flat and authoritative over the dull roar of the airport terminal. DeAndre's fake charisma completely shattered. He took a wild, desperate step backward, but strong hands immediately gripped his arms forcefully, twisting them behind his back. The sharp, heavy click of metal handcuffs locking securely around his wrists echoed through the crowded boarding area. Hundreds of waiting passengers turned to stare, pulling out their smartphones to record the spectacle as the slick, arrogant crypto-millionaire was publicly frog-marched away from the gate, his duffel bag of stolen cash seized as federal evidence. While DeAndre was being locked in a federal holding cell, the final crushing blow was being delivered to my parents. With the IRS launching a massive criminal audit, the federal government immediately moved to freeze every single financial asset Jerome and Brenda possessed. Their domestic checking accounts, their corporate operational funds, and their personal savings were locked down, pending the outcome of the tax evasion investigation. Jerome could not buy a cup of coffee, let alone make the staggering monthly mortgage payment on his sprawling suburban mansion. This was the exact moment my corporate shell company stepped out of the shadows. Months ago, anticipating this exact financial collapse, I had instructed my wealth management team to quietly purchase the heavily leveraged debt on my parents' home through an anonymous holding corporation. I legally owned the mortgage, and the second Jerome missed his payment, my lawyers executed the foreclosure clause with absolute uncompromising brutality. We offered no grace periods. We entertained no negotiations for an extension. The eviction was processed through the Fulton County courts with lightning speed. On a humid, overcast Friday morning, two marked Fulton County sheriff's cruisers pulled up the long, manicured driveway of the estate. Jerome and Brenda were sitting in the living room, surrounded by past due notices and legal summons still operating under the delusion that they could somehow talk their way out of this nightmare. Heavy authoritative knocking rattled the front door. The exact same door Jerome had locked behind me when he threw me out onto the street with nothing but a trash bag of old clothes. Jerome opened the door, his face pale and drawn. The lead deputy handed him a laminated clipboard holding the official eviction mandate. "Mr. Wilson, the property has been legally foreclosed upon," the deputy stated, his face completely devoid of sympathy. "The bank now owns this estate. You and your family have exactly 30 minutes to gather whatever personal belongings you can carry. After that, we are locking the doors and changing the locks. If you attempt to re-enter the premises, you will be arrested for criminal trespassing." Brenda let out a piercing, hysterical wail. "You cannot do this. We live here. This is our home. You have to give us time." "30 minutes, ma'am," the deputy repeated, resting his hand casually on his utility belt. "The clock is ticking." Absolute feral panic took over. The refined high society facade Brenda had spent her entire adult life cultivating evaporated instantly. She scrambled up the grand staircase, screaming for Nia, who was still hiding in her old childhood bedroom after learning of DeAndre's airport arrest. They had no moving trucks. They had no storage units. They were reduced to frantic animals tearing through their luxurious walk-in closets, furiously shoving designer shoes, expensive jewelry, and handfuls of clothing into heavy-duty black plastic trash bags. Jerome stumbled through his home office, grabbing whatever loose cash and personal files he could find. His hands shaking so violently, he dropped half of them onto the imported rug. Exactly 30 minutes later, the deputies physically escorted them out of the house. Neighbors stood on their manicured lawns, watching openly as the once proud Wilson family dragged heavy black garbage bags across the driveway. Jerome's luxury sedan had already been repossessed earlier in the week. They were forced to cram their belongings into the back of Nia's heavily dented leased compact car. I sat in the back of my armored Maybach, parked discreetly at the end of the cul-de-sac behind a row of tall oak trees. The tinted windows hid me completely. I watched the heavy deadbolt click shut on the front door. I watched my father aggressively shove a trash bag into the trunk, his shoulders slumped in total defeat. I watched them drive away from the only life they had ever valued, stripped of their wealth, their pride, and their power. They drove for an hour, heading far outside the wealthy city limits, pulling into the cracked, weed-infested parking lot of a rundown motel near the interstate. The neon sign above the office sputtered and buzzed, missing half of its letters. The air smelled strongly of stale cigarette smoke, damp mildew, and cheap bleach. They dragged their garbage bags into a cramped, dingy room with peeling wallpaper and a stained carpet. Nia immediately collapsed onto one of the sagging twin beds, staring blankly at the popcorn ceiling, completely paralyzed by the reality that her husband was facing federal prison and she was entirely broke. Jerome sat at the small, wobbly laminate table, holding his head in his hands, staring blindly at the grimy floor. Brenda, operating on raw, frantic adrenaline, began aggressively tearing open the trash bags, desperately trying to organize their pathetic remaining possessions. She pulled out a crumpled stack of mail and legal documents Jerome had swept off his desk during the eviction. She smoothed out the stiff, heavy stock paper of the official eviction notice, her eyes scanning the complex legal jargon, desperately looking for a loophole, a mistake, a bank error she could somehow fight. Her eyes tracked down to the bottom of the page, where the official stamp of the holding company that now owned their home was printed. Apex Horizon Holdings, LLC. Brenda frowned. She pulled her smartphone from her pocket, her thumbs flying across the cracked screen. She accessed the Georgia Secretary of State corporate registry database, typing the name of the holding company into the search bar. She needed to know who owned the bank that had just destroyed her life. The web page loaded slowly on the motel's terrible internet connection. The corporate filing appeared on the screen detailing the registered agent, the business address, and the primary executive officer. Brenda stopped breathing. The phone slipped from her trembling fingers, hitting the cheap laminate table with a sharp clatter. Jerome looked up, irritated by the noise. "What is it?" he snapped, his voice rough and defeated. Brenda slowly raised her head. Her face was entirely devoid of color, her eyes wide with a horrifying, crushing revelation. She realized they had not been beaten by a faceless bank. They had not been victims of bad luck or corporate bureaucracy. They had been systematically, legally, and mercilessly dismantled. It was Kiara. Brenda whispered, the sound barely escaping her throat. "Kiara owns the holding company. She bought the house, Jerome. She evicted us." It was Kiara. Brenda whispered, the sound barely escaping her throat. "Kiara owns the holding company. She bought the house, Jerome. She evicted us." Jerome snatched the phone from her trembling hands, his bloodshot eyes scanning the corporate registration data glowing on the cracked screen. His mind, usually so sharp and heavily reliant on aggressive manipulation, completely fractured under the weight of the undeniable truth. He dropped the phone onto the stained, sticky carpet. He did not yell. He did not fly into one of his signature righteous patriarchal rages. He simply brought his hands to his face and began to weep, a pathetic, hollow grating sound that echoed off the peeling, nicotine-stained wallpaper of the cheap motel room. He realized in that agonizing moment that every single catastrophe of the past week, the public humiliation, the frozen bank accounts, the looming federal indictments, and the brutal, rapid eviction had all been meticulously orchestrated by the daughter he had treated like dirt. Nia curled into a tight, trembling ball on the sagging mattress, her perfect manicured nails digging deep into the cheap, scratchy polyester bedspread. She was mourning the absolute loss of her lavish, unearned lifestyle, the impending lengthy imprisonment of her fraudulent husband, and the horrifying reality that her despised older sister now controlled their entire universe. The roaches scurried brazenly along the rotting baseboards, entirely undeterred by the weeping former millionaires occupying the room. Brenda knew Jerome was utterly broken. She knew Nia was entirely useless in a crisis. Brenda realized she was the only one left with enough raw survival instinct to try and salvage a single scrap from the smoking wreckage of their lives. She dug frantically through her designer purse, her hands shaking violently until she found her phone. She scrolled frantically past the numbers of her high society friends, all of whom had already blocked her calls following the news of the federal raid, and found my contact information. She prayed the number was still active. Across the city, I sat in the sprawling, pristine living area of my newly purchased ultra-secure penthouse, overlooking the glittering Atlanta skyline. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the empire I now quietly commanded. I was dressed in comfortable, understated gray cashmere, resting in a plush armchair, sipping a glass of imported sparkling water. On the polished marble coffee table lay the finalized, legally binding foreclosure documents, signed, sealed, and executed. The physical paper trail of my absolute victory. Beside those thick legal documents sat a single, inexpensive prepaid cell phone. I had explicitly instructed my legal team to port my old phone number to this specific, untraceable device. I had kept it active for one reason alone. I knew human nature intimately. I knew my mother's specific brand of desperation. I knew that once the initial shock wore off and the terrifying reality of poverty set in, Brenda would inevitably reach out. She would try to negotiate with the monster she had actively created. The cheap plastic phone began to vibrate violently against the cold marble, emitting a shrill generic ringtone that sliced through the quiet luxury of the penthouse. The caller ID flashed a familiar, unsaved number. I stared at the glowing screen for a long, deliberate moment, savoring the profound, monumental shift in power. For decades, a call from that specific number meant an impending lecture, a harsh demand for servitude, or a cruel calculated reminder of my inadequacies. Now it meant absolute surrender. I picked up the phone and pressed answer, bringing the device to my ear. I did not speak. I let the heavy loaded silence stretch across the cellular connection, establishing dominance without uttering a single syllable. Kiara Brenda gasped, her voice cracking instantly, sounding completely breathless. Kiara baby, please do not hang up. Please talk to me. Her voice was stripped entirely of its usual haughty country club arrogance. It was a raw, frantic begging sound. It was the sound of a woman standing at the very edge of a crumbling cliff, staring directly down into the abyss. I remained completely silent, letting the quiet atmospheric hum of my penthouse contrast violently with the chaotic, desperate energy radiating from her end of the line. Kiara, please, you have to listen to me, Brenda pleaded, her words tumbling over each other in a frantic, undisciplined rush. We are in hell, baby. We are living in a nightmare. DeAndre is locked up in federal holding, and the judge will not grant him bail because he is a flight risk. Your father is facing a massive grand jury indictment. The IRS has frozen every single account we have. We cannot even buy decent food. I took a slow, calm sip of my sparkling water. The silence stretched again, a tactical void, forcing her to fill the empty space with her own mounting panic. We are at a disgusting motel off the interstate, Brenda sobbed, the sound of her jagged crying echoing harshly through the speaker. It is filthy, Kiara. There are insects crawling everywhere. The lock on the door barely works. We have nothing but garbage bags filled with wrinkled clothes. You cannot do this to us. You cannot leave us like this. We are your family. We are your blood. She was actively utilizing every manipulative tactic in her extensive, well-worn arsenal. The heavy guilt trip, the fabricated victim narrative, the sacred biological obligation. It was a performance she had perfected over a lifetime of successfully avoiding accountability. I know you are extremely angry, Brenda continued, her voice taking on a pathetic, bargaining tone. I know things were very difficult between us, but you proved your point. You showed everyone how incredibly successful you are. You have $80 million, Kiara. You own our house. You literally own the roof over our heads. We have absolutely nothing left to fight you with. Please, I am begging you on my hands and knees. Just give us our home back. Just transfer the deed back to your father so we have somewhere safe to sleep tonight. You can keep the rest of the money. Just give us the house. You can't leave your mother on the street. She paused, gasping heavily for air, waiting for the maternal guilt to take effect. She genuinely believed that somewhere deep down, beneath the newly acquired wealth and legal armor, the broken, eager-to-please daughter still existed. She truly believed she could summon that phantom daughter to magically save her from the devastating consequences of her own horrific actions. I let the silence hang for another agonizing 15 seconds. I wanted her to feel the vast, unbridgeable distance between us. I wanted her to understand that she was speaking to an impenetrable wall of solid ice. When I finally spoke, my voice was entirely devoid of anger, sadness, or vindictiveness. It was cold, flat, and absolute. It was the voice of a supreme judge delivering a final, unappealable verdict. You are confused about exactly who you are speaking to, I stated clearly, my words clipping through the air. I do not have a family. Brenda gasped, a sharp, ragged, terrifying sound. Kiara, do not say that. I am your mother. I gave birth to you. I always loved you even when your father was hard on you. I tried to protect you behind closed doors. The blatant historical revisionism was almost amusing in its audacity. You did not protect me, I replied, my tone icy and relentlessly precise. You stood proudly on the front porch and watched your husband throw me into the freezing rain. You actively drained my collegiate bank account to buy a luxury car for a federal criminal. You conspired to steal my lottery winnings and send me permanently back to the gutter. You made your choices with complete, unwavering clarity. I am sorry, Brenda wailed, the carefully constructed facade completely shattering into a million pieces. I am so incredibly sorry. We were desperate. We made a terrible mistake. Please, Kiara, you have to help us. You are our only hope. I stood up from the velvet sofa and walked slowly over to the floor-to-ceiling windows. I looked out over the glittering, sprawling city lights, feeling the undeniable, intoxicating weight of my hard-won freedom. I thought back to that miserable Tuesday morning. I thought about the heavy black trash bags hitting the wet pavement. I thought about the vicious sneers on their faces. I remembered the exact unforgivable words they had used to strip me of my dignity. I held the phone closer to my mouth, ensuring every single syllable would be permanently etched into her memory. "Get out, you lowlife," I said, matching the exact cadence and venom they had used against me. "Uneducated trash doesn't belong in my family." For a split second, there was total breathless silence on the line. The brutal kinetic impact of her own recycled words hit her with devastating, undeniable force. She realized with absolute crushing certainty that there was no hidden reserve of affection. There was no secret well of forgiveness. There was only a mirrored reflection of her own profound cruelty staring back at her with unblinking, lethal indifference. Then the silence broke. Brenda let out a guttural, agonizing scream of pure, unfiltered despair. It was not a performative cry for sympathy. It was the horrific, animalistic shriek of a woman who had just watched her entire world burn completely to the ground, knowing she was the one holding the match. The sound vibrated violently through the cheap plastic speaker of the burner phone, a dark symphony of total, irreversible defeat. I did not listen to the rest of the scream. I calmly moved my thumb over the screen and pressed the red button, instantly cutting off the transmission. The sudden, absolute silence in my penthouse was beautiful. I did not stop there. I popped open the back casing of the burner phone. I carefully removed the tiny gold-plated SIM card. I held it between my thumb and forefinger for a brief moment, recognizing it as the final lingering toxic thread that connected me to the swamp of my past. With a sharp, deliberate motion, I snapped the SIM card cleanly in half. I tossed the broken plastic pieces into the sleek stainless steel trash receptacle beside my desk. The connection to my abusers was completely, permanently, and irrevocably severed. They were no longer my problem. They were simply ghosts trapped in a rundown motel, haunted forever by the millions they had lost and the daughter they had thrown away. The swift and unforgiving machinery of the federal justice system took over exactly where I left off. I did not have to lift another finger against my family. I simply sat back and watched as the catastrophic avalanche they had triggered completely buried them. Jerome's spectacular downfall was meticulously documented on the local evening news. Without access to his frozen assets or his high-priced attorney, he was forced to rely on an overworked public defender who clearly despised him. The IRS audit tore through his logistics company like a hurricane, exposing years of fabricated invoices, ghost employees, and illegal offshore transfers. The federal grand jury indictment was swift and merciless. During his sentencing hearing, Jerome stood before a federal judge wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, his flashy, aggressive suits and patriarchal arrogance entirely stripped away. He tried to offer a rambling, self-pitying explanation about providing for his family and making minor accounting errors, but the judge cut him off sharply. Jerome was sentenced to 12 years in a federal penitentiary for massive tax evasion and money laundering. He was hauled out of the courtroom in heavy metal handcuffs, an utterly broken man facing a decade behind bars with absolutely no one waiting for him on the outside. Nia experienced a different, far more public kind of prison. The explosive news of DeAndre's airport arrest and his massive cryptocurrency fraud instantly vaporized her carefully curated social media empire. The internet, always ravenous for a spectacular downfall, turned on her with vicious enthusiasm. Her former sponsors dropped her immediately, erasing her from their campaigns overnight. Her high society friends blocked her number and pretended they had never met her. Debt collectors seized her leased luxury cars, her designer handbags, and her custom jewelry. Completely destitute, facing mounting legal bills, and desperate for basic survival, Nia was forced into the only job that would hire someone linked to a high-profile federal fraud case. She traded her haute couture gowns for a stiff polyester uniform that permanently smelled of stale fry grease. Nia now worked the graveyard shift at a fast food drive-thru on the bleak, dangerous outskirts of Atlanta. Under the harsh, unforgiving glare of the fluorescent security lights, she stood by the drive-thru window wearing a heavy plastic headset. Her perfectly manicured nails were gone, replaced by cracked, grease-stained hands. One humid Friday night, a car full of teenagers pulled up to her window. One of them recognized her from her old viral posts and immediately snapped a flash photograph, laughing loudly as they drove away. Nia did not yell or try to hide. She just stood there staring blankly at the glowing red taillights, completely crushed under the weight of her permanent, inescapable humiliation. Atlanta had chewed her up and spit her out, and her reputation was irreversibly destroyed. While they rotted in the literal and figurative prisons they had so eagerly dug for themselves, I focused entirely on building my legacy. The $80 million was not just a shield against my past. It was the unshakable foundation for a brilliant, unassailable future. I purchased a massive abandoned industrial warehouse in the heart of downtown Atlanta, pouring millions into a total ground-up renovation. I transformed the cavernous brick space into a state-of-the-art culinary and business incubator. I named it the Vanguard Forge. The facility boasted 5 gleaming commercial-grade stainless steel test kitchens, a fully staffed legal clinic, dynamic marketing suites, and a massive community dining hall designed specifically for pop-up restaurant testing. The Vanguard Forge was not a generic charity. It was a highly specific, fiercely protective sanctuary. I dedicated the entire incubator exclusively to funding, mentoring, and legally protecting young, underprivileged Black entrepreneurs. I specifically sought out the visionaries, the chefs, the creators, and the builders who had been rejected, belittled, or financially abused by their own families. I found the young women who had been told their culinary dreams were worthless. I found the young men whose parents had stolen their hard-earned savings to fund their own selfish mistakes. I became the exact benefactor I had desperately needed when I was sleeping on a cot in a sweltering storage closet. I provided them with zero-interest seed capital, top-tier corporate legal representation to trademark their intellectual property, and the physical space to build their empires without fear of predatory loans or familial theft. Walking through the vibrant, bustling halls of the Vanguard Forge became my greatest joy. The air was constantly filled with the rich, complex aromas of a dozen different cuisines being perfected, mixed with the sound of brilliant young minds negotiating contracts and building generational wealth. I walked among them not as a distant billionaire, but as an active mentor who knew exactly what it felt like to be told she was nothing. I watched them thrive, knowing that every single success they achieved was a profound, undeniable victory over the kind of toxic patriarchal abuse I had barely survived. Months later, the grand opening of the incubator was a completely flawless, highly publicized triumph. I left the bustling celebration just before midnight, letting my elite security detail drive me back to my ultra-luxury high-rise in the center of the city. I stepped off the private elevator and walked through my quiet, impeccably designed penthouse. I poured a glass of vintage champagne and slid open the heavy glass doors leading out to my expansive private balcony. The cool night air rushed over me, carrying the distant, energetic hum of the city below. I stepped up to the glass railing, looking out over the endless, glittering expanse of the Atlanta skyline. The city stretched out in every direction, a vast network of lights and infinite possibilities. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the champagne. The taste was sharp, cold, and flawless. I thought about my father sitting in a bleak concrete federal cell, stripped of his voice and his authority. I thought about my sister wiping down a greasy counter under flickering lights, terrified of being recognized. I thought about the hundreds of brilliant young entrepreneurs who were currently sleeping safely, knowing their businesses were fully funded and legally protected by my empire. I realized, standing high above the city, that I had achieved the ultimate, sweetest retribution. The true victory was never about screaming matches or physical revenge. The ultimate revenge was simply stepping completely out of their way. It was letting their own blinding arrogance, their vicious greed, and their petty cruelty dig their own graves. They had destroyed themselves perfectly, effectively, and permanently. I did not have to fight them in the mud. I just had to survive long enough to purchase the ground they stood on. I closed my eyes, letting the cool wind wash over my face, feeling an absolute, unbreakable sense of total peace. I was entirely untouchable. I was a queen standing at the very top of a world I had built with my own two hands. Fade to black.